Imagine a time when the sun barely pierced the haze of ash and smoke that choked the sky. The medieval world, though often painted with grandeur by historians, was, for the average person, a landscape of fear, scarcity, and unpredictability. The streets of bustling towns, though alive with the clamour of everyday life, were never far from the simmering tension of survival. Life could change in an instant. A sudden siege could trap a town, a plague could wipe out entire families, and a famine could turn neighbours into enemies. Survival in this era was not guaranteed. It wasn't about merely finding food or building shelter. It was about navigating an endless storm of dangers, many of which came from forces beyond one's control. The world was fractured by constant war. Towns were regularly besieged, plundered, and burned by warring factions, each seeking to claim dominance. In these moments, the average person had little chance. They were often caught in the crossfire, their lives reduced to mere pawns in a much larger game. Entire communities could be wiped out overnight. But it wasn't just the sword that threatened survival. The most insidious danger was often invisible. Plague, like a shadow creeping across the land, would strike without warning. It would take hold of whole populations, leaving towns half empty, their streets littered with the bodies of the dead. To make matters worse, there was no cure, no understanding of the invisible forces at play. People died in agony, and the survivors were left to face a world growing ever more desolate. It was an uncertain, terrifying existence, where each day could bring death or devastation. Famine was no less a cruel threat. Crops could fail for reasons no one understood. A long, harsh winter could devastate food stores, leaving families with nothing but the bitter wind and the gnawing hunger that never seemed to subside. In these moments, survival often depended not on strength or skill, but on the ability to endure, to find hidden resources, and to trust in the few who were willing to help. Trust, however, was a luxury in a time when betrayal was a constant reality. The very concept of survival was at odds with everything around you. The world you lived in could be swept away in an instant. Your home, your family, your life, nothing was certain. And yet, beneath this constant chaos, something far more subtle was taking shape. It wasn't just a matter of fortifying walls or hoarding food. It was about the quiet, unseen networks that began to form in the shadows. In the face of constant destruction, there emerged a system of survival unlike anything the history books often tell us. What if survival in medieval times wasn't just about food or weapons, but about hidden systems and secret networks operating in the shadows? Networks that could keep you safe, not through brute force, but through knowledge, secrecy, and an unspoken bond of trust. These networks, born out of desperation, would become the lifeblood of those who sought to outlast the chaos around them. But how did these hidden systems come to be, and why did they remain largely unseen for so long? The chaos of medieval life laid the foundation for something more than mere survival. It gave rise to secret societies, hidden shelters, and covert operations that were as vital as food and water in times of crisis. In the face of violence, disease, and famine, people began to turn to each other in ways that history has often overlooked. These underground survival networks were the threads holding the tattered fabric of society together in times when everything else seemed to be falling apart. And so, in the darkest hours of the medieval world, when the light of hope seemed almost extinguished, a new kind of survival began to take root, one that wasn't visible to the eye, yet was woven into the very heart of the communities struggling to survive. It was this network, hidden and often erased, that would prove to be the key to enduring the darkest periods of history. And as we move forward, we'll explore the subtle emergence of these hidden systems, diving deeper into the untold story of survival against the odds. What started as quiet whispers in the shadows would, in time, become the lifeline of countless towns and villages throughout the medieval world. In the chaos of the medieval world, where famine, plague, and war were regular visitors, survival depended on more than what could be seen or touched. Beneath the surface of everyday life, a hidden world began to take shape, one that existed in the shadows, away from the eyes of the authorities. This was a world built on secrecy, trust, and quiet resilience. It was a network of individuals who, when faced with annihilation, chose to help each other rather than perish alone. In towns and villages across medieval Europe, survival was a group effort, but not the kind of effort that history often acknowledges. While armies were fighting battles and rulers were securing their thrones, the real battle for survival was happening beneath their noses. The people who kept entire towns alive during the worst crises, who provided food, shelter, and protection, were never seen as heroes, nor were they remembered by name. They were ordinary men and women, peasants, craftsmen, and traders, whose actions went largely unnoticed by the outside world. What if those who held entire communities together were never recognized for their bravery or even known by name? These survival networks were not just about scavenging for food. They were about something far deeper: trust. It was the trust that allowed communities to organize covertly, to protect themselves not only from external threats, but from the growing danger within. The fear of betrayal was always close. In a world where the wrong word or action could lead to death, these networks had to be kept secret, hidden from spies, soldiers, and those in power who might see them as a threat. The means of communication were equally concealed. Local people didn't rely on public meetings or open plans. Instead, they spoke in code words and symbols that only trusted individuals could understand. These were the quiet heroes who passed along secret messages, who left hidden signs in plain sight, and who relied on whispers in the night. It was a silent language, carried by those who knew that their survival depended on the secrecy they maintained. At the heart of these underground networks were the hidden tunnels and passageways. Beneath many medieval towns, there existed an intricate web of passageways that were unknown to most. These secret paths allowed survivors to move between homes, find shelter, or escape from an imminent attack. They were also used to store precious supplies: food, water, medicine, things that could mean the difference between life and death when supplies were scarce. The tunnels weren't just physical passages, they were lifelines, offering both escape and refuge. The people who knew of these secret routes were the quiet architects of survival, ensuring that those who relied on them could live to fight another day. But these networks weren't only concerned with physical survival, they were just as deeply invested in gathering intelligence. In times of war, information was as valuable as any weapon. People within these networks often acted as spies, gathering critical information about enemy movements, political shifts, or impending dangers. A simple rumor could save a life, and a well-timed piece of intelligence could change the fate of an entire town. Those who worked within these secret systems were often well informed of events beyond the town walls, providing a strategic advantage that was essential for survival. In a world where external forces could destroy entire communities, the quiet networks that formed were about more than mere existence. They were about resistance. These were systems created not only for survival, but for the preservation of culture, identity, and community. They were not bound by walls or titles, but by the unspoken agreement that every individual had a role to play in the fight for survival. Imagine, for a moment, the quiet figure moving through the shadows, carrying messages from one safe house to another, navigating a labyrinth of hidden tunnels that no one else dared to venture. Their names are lost to history, their faces forgotten, but their actions were the foundation on which entire communities stood. While kings and generals may have made decisions that shaped the course of battles, it was the unsung heroes, the ones who worked beneath the surface, that determined whether towns would survive or fall. And so, these underground survival networks operated in the shadows, their complexity and resilience ensuring that towns and villages could weather the worst crises. But what did these systems truly look like? How did they function? And what role did they play in shaping the world as we know it? In the next section, we will begin to peel back the layers and explore the inner workings of these hidden systems, revealing the intricate logistics that allowed these survival networks to thrive. In every town, in every village that managed to survive the chaos of the medieval world, there were invisible hands at work, individuals who guided the survival networks, steering them through treacherous times. These figures were the secret leaders, the masterminds whose wisdom and foresight shaped the course of history, even though their names have been lost to time. In an era when survival was a constant battle, these leaders understood something that most could not: the power of collaboration, trust, and ingenuity. Their role was not to lead with armies or swords, but to orchestrate the quiet, hidden movements that would keep entire towns alive through times of plague, siege, and famine. Behind every underground survival network, there were secret leaders whose names have been lost to time. What did they know that history never taught us? These leaders were not the ones to stand in the public eye or record their actions for posterity. Instead, they worked behind the scenes, pulling the strings of an invisible operation. Often, they were the ones who knew how to hide critical resources, food supplies, medicine, and weapons where no one could find them. They understood that survival wasn't just about hoarding food. It was about using what little you had in ways that would outlast the immediate crisis. These forgotten architects of survival knew the value of secrecy. They understood that if the wrong people learned of a food cache or a hidden shelter, it could mean death for the entire network. So, they devised systems that went unnoticed, places where food could be stored without drawing attention, methods of securing weapons that remained hidden, and routes through the town that only a trusted few knew. These leaders were not just organizing resources, they were organizing trust, fostering relationships that transcended the usual divisions of society. Some of these leaders were individuals who had no official power. They were not lords or knights, but peasants, merchants, and craftspeople who knew how to move quietly in the background. They were the ones who could read a person's face and know whether they were to be trusted. They could gather a group of individuals and inspire them to work together, even in the most desperate of times. They understood that in the face of overwhelming forces, the only hope for survival was unity and resourcefulness. Their tactics went beyond merely hiding supplies. They forged alliances, sometimes with people who would have been considered enemies in another world. Rival townships, political factions, and even warring families could be brought together under the right conditions, working toward a common goal: survival. The ability to navigate these complex social dynamics and form these fragile alliances was a skill that many of these leaders possessed in abundance. They understood that in such a time of uncertainty, every relationship could mean the difference between life and death. Moreover, these architects of survival took full advantage of the infrastructure available to them. Medieval towns were often designed with hidden passages, secret rooms, and concealed courtyards, built during periods of relative peace. These hidden spaces were invaluable when the world around you was crumbling. The leaders of the underground survival networks knew these towns inside and out. They knew where the secret passageways were, the locked cellars, and the hidden wells. These were not just places of refuge, they were hubs of activity, where plans were made, alliances were formed, and survival was ensured. Their brilliance was in their ability to stay out of sight while making sure everything worked. They never needed to step into the light, because their work was done in the shadows. They were the architects of a system that ensured survival not by force, but through intelligence, patience, and careful planning. Yet, over time, their names were lost, their contributions erased by the very crises they helped to avert. But these quiet leaders, often the most overlooked and unrecognized figures in history, were the ones who kept entire communities from collapsing. They operated in silence, driven not by the desire for fame, but by the drive to see their people survive against the odds. What they knew, and how they worked, may never be fully understood. But their legacy is etched in the survival of the towns that thrived, unnoticed, in a world that seemed doomed to fall apart. As we move forward, we will look at specific examples of towns that not only survived, but flourished through these hidden networks. These examples will bring to life the strategies discussed here, showing how ordinary individuals, guided by extraordinary foresight, shaped the fate of entire communities. There is a town that few have ever heard of, a place lost to the pages of history, erased from the annals of time. Its name is Alindra, a small medieval settlement that, for a year, became the unlikely cradle of survival against overwhelming odds. The town's tale is not one of famed kings or towering castles. Instead, it is a story of everyday people, of ordinary lives fighting against a relentless siege, where the difference between life and death depended on quiet, hidden networks that worked in the shadows. How did a medieval town survive a year-long siege when its resources were cut off, and why did no one ever hear about it? Most people would assume that the fall of Alindra was inevitable, that the lack of food, the constant bombardment, and the encroaching enemy forces would break the town within weeks. But Alindra, against all odds, held on. And its survival was not due to sheer force, but to the cleverness and foresight of a hidden network, a system that had been built long before the siege even began. When the first enemy forces arrived outside Alindra's walls, they were met with resistance, as expected. The town's defenders, armed with what little they had, fought valiantly. But the siege was not a battle that would be won by swords alone. The enemy quickly surrounded the town, cutting off all access to supplies, and the people of Alindra were forced to rely on what they had within their walls. Food stores, already dwindling before the siege, were now the only thing keeping the town from surrendering. However, what the invaders did not know, and what Alindra's people relied on, was the carefully prepared system of hidden food caches, secret wells, and concealed shelters. These systems, constructed in times of peace but maintained in secrecy, had been designed specifically to withstand long sieges. In quiet corners of the town, beneath the floors of homes, and deep within the walls of abandoned buildings, food was hidden. Grain, dried meats, and salted fish were stored in ways that only a few trusted individuals knew. Even the supply of fresh water, often the first thing to run out during a siege, had been safeguarded with secret wells dug deep beneath the town's streets. The town's defenders knew how to access these supplies without alerting the besieging forces. But Alindra's survival was not simply about food, it was also about communication. The siege was long, stretching over months, with the enemy army outside waiting for the people to break. But Alindra's inhabitants communicated in ways that their enemies never understood. Using coded messages and hidden symbols, they could share critical information without anyone outside the circle knowing. These communications were sent through trusted messengers, who knew the town's secret paths, the same paths that had been used to hide supplies. The messengers moved like shadows through the town, silently delivering information that kept the town united, informed, and prepared for what was to come. When the food stores began to run low, Alindra's people didn't panic. Instead, they turned to ingenuity. The town's skilled artisans and craftsmen worked together to create more supplies from what they had left. Leather was turned into new shoes for those who had none. Broken pottery was reformed into makeshift tools. The town's resourcefulness was as important as its food stores. The secret network that had once provided for them in times of peace was now keeping them alive during the worst crisis imaginable. And yet, it wasn't just about surviving day to day. There were moments when the siege felt like it would end in disaster, when the town's defenses were breached, and when morale began to falter. But it was in these dark moments that Alindra's hidden leadership emerged. A small group of trusted figures, never acknowledged publicly, but known to all, quietly reinforced the spirits of the people. They organized covert meetings, where plans were made to fortify defenses and strengthen the resolve of the citizens. They brought together different factions within the town that had once been divided and united them in the face of a common enemy. These leaders, forgotten by history, were the invisible architects of the town's survival. And so, through months of deprivation, cold nights, and mounting pressure, Alindra endured. The enemy forces outside grew weary, their hopes dashed by the realization that they were fighting not just against a town, but against a network that had been prepared long before their arrival. The invaders eventually withdrew, their resolve broken, and the town of Alindra emerged, battered but unbowed. Why did Alindra survive when so many other towns fell? The answer lies not in the strength of its walls or the bravery of its soldiers, but in the quiet, hidden networks that ensured its survival. These networks were the backbone of the town's endurance, operating in the shadows, unnoticed by the enemy, but essential to Alindra's ability to withstand the impossible. The survival of Alindra was not a story of war, it was a story of resourcefulness, of secret knowledge, and of the resilience of a community determined to survive against all odds. The story of Alindra offers us a glimpse into the hidden survival networks that shaped the course of history. And as we move forward, we will look at other towns that, like Alindra, survived against all expectations. These stories will help us understand how underground survival networks were not just rare exceptions, but essential lifelines in the medieval world, quiet, unseen forces that kept entire communities alive through the darkest moments in history. The Black Death, one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, swept across Europe with a brutal efficiency, leaving behind a trail of devastation and death. Entire cities were ravaged, their populations decimated by a disease that struck without warning, leaving no room for preparation. But in the midst of this chaos, some villages, seemingly against all odds, managed to survive. How did some villages manage to escape the devastation of the Black Death? Was it luck, or something much darker and more mysterious? The official narrative of the plague often centers on the widespread horror and chaos, the gruesome images of bodies piling up in the streets, and the helplessness of the authorities. But there is another side to the story, a side that remains largely hidden from the historical record. While many towns fell victim to the plague's wrath, others, some small, remote, or seemingly insignificant, remained untouched. How was this possible when the disease was spreading so rapidly and relentlessly? The answer, perhaps, lies not in fate, but in the hidden networks of survival that these villages had in place long before the plague arrived. At the heart of these secret survival systems was knowledge that had been passed down through generations, knowledge that was not shared openly but kept within trusted circles. Healers, often viewed with suspicion by the mainstream medical community, held the key to survival. They knew the land, the plants, the herbs, and the methods that could help stave off illness. These healers were not necessarily scholars or physicians trained in formal practices, but individuals who had inherited a deep understanding of nature and medicine. Their knowledge was passed down through families, through whispered teachings, and kept safe from prying eyes. These healers played a crucial role in protecting the villages from the plague. They worked in secrecy, providing remedies and treatments that were unavailable to the larger population. Their ability to recognize early symptoms of the disease, to administer herbal concoctions that might alleviate some of the symptoms, or to isolate the infected before they could spread the disease, could make all the difference. But their work wasn't just about medicine, it was about trust. In times of crisis, trust becomes the most valuable currency. Communities that had long-standing relationships, where people trusted one another implicitly, were better able to withstand the fear and panic that accompanied the plague. In these villages, secrecy was essential. When the plague began to spread, the leaders of these communities, whether known or unknown, acted swiftly to protect their people. Isolated sanctuaries were established, places where individuals could go to recover in peace and safety, away from the panic of the town. These sanctuaries, often hidden deep in the woods or in caves, were maintained by a network of individuals who knew how to keep the infected hidden from the prying eyes of neighboring towns. These hidden refuges were not just places of physical isolation, but also psychological sanctuaries, offering comfort and hope when the world seemed to be crumbling. But the survival mechanisms weren't just tangible, there were intangible elements at play as well. Knowledge sharing became critical. Information on how to avoid the plague, where the disease was most likely to strike, and what measures to take to protect oneself was passed secretly, often in coded messages or through trusted intermediaries. These messages didn't just travel across villages, they traveled across time, carried by a network of individuals who understood that the survival of the community depended not just on what they knew, but on who could be trusted with that knowledge. Perhaps even more significant was the role of the collective spirit of the village. In times of widespread fear and death, many of these villages found ways to hold on to hope. They banded together, working as one cohesive unit, driven by the understanding that their survival depended on each other. While larger towns were plagued by rumors, panic, and betrayal, these smaller villages, with their networks of trust and secrecy, were able to maintain a sense of solidarity that kept the plague at bay. And yet, the survival of these villages was not merely luck. It was a deliberate effort, built on years of careful preparation and the cultivation of networks that were invisible to the outside world. When the plague came, these hidden systems were already in place. They were the unseen forces that worked behind the scenes, ensuring that these villages could endure. How many villages did survive the plague in this manner? The records are unclear, as many of these stories were never documented, and the details of their survival were erased by time. But what is certain is that there was something more than just luck at play. There was a network, a web of hidden knowledge, trust, and secrecy that gave these communities a fighting chance when everything else seemed doomed. These hidden survival networks were the backbone of resilience in the face of one of the deadliest pandemics in history. As we delve deeper into the survival strategies that protected these villages, we will begin to uncover how this knowledge was preserved and passed down over generations, often in secret, hidden from those who might have sought to control it. This knowledge, sometimes locked away in forgotten manuscripts or passed through oral tradition, became the key to survival in future crises, ensuring that the quiet networks of resistance and survival would continue for centuries to come. As the medieval era faded into history, one might think the underground survival networks that had once kept towns alive would have faded with it. Yet, the necessity of these hidden systems did not disappear. Instead, their influence carried forward through time, becoming the foundation for some of the most powerful resistance movements and secret societies in history. These covert networks, once born out of sheer necessity in the face of famine, plague, and war, evolved into intricate webs that shaped major events across centuries. They were no longer simply survival systems, they were the very architecture of resistance. Could the secret survival networks of medieval towns be the forgotten foundation of the most powerful resistance movements in history? It is a question that history often overlooks. But when we look closely at how these networks functioned in the past, it becomes clear that the threads woven in medieval times were the same ones that would later be pulled by revolutionaries, dissidents, and those who fought for freedom in darker periods of history. The first traces of these underground networks' influence can be found in the societies that arose after the medieval period, during the Renaissance and beyond. As Europe moved into the early modern era, political and religious upheaval created fertile ground for the resurgence of covert resistance. Secret societies, like the Freemasons for instance, can trace their roots back to these early networks, built upon the same principles of trust, secrecy, and mutual aid. These organizations grew from the very soil that medieval survival networks had nurtured, an environment where secrecy was not just a tool of survival, but a weapon of resistance. The idea that survival itself could be a form of resistance became deeply ingrained in the culture of these secret societies. In medieval times, survival networks were about outlasting external threats, whether they were marauding invaders, feudal lords, or disease. As centuries passed, these same networks evolved into more organized efforts, becoming political tools. As monarchs sought to impose control over Europe, secret societies and underground movements became the lifeblood of resistance. They did not just endure, they fought back. The most significant manifestation of this evolution occurred during times of war. The French resistance in World War II, for example, was an embodiment of the survival tactics that had been honed by medieval networks. Just as medieval villagers had relied on secret passageways and hidden caches to survive sieges, the resistance groups of the 20th century relied on covert operations, secret codes, and underground communications to subvert Nazi occupation. The very structure of these movements, their underground cells, their reliance on trust among a small group of individuals, and their ability to remain hidden from authorities echoed the practices first developed during medieval times. In fact, the mechanics of these later resistance movements were strikingly similar to those of medieval networks. Both depended on the ability to organize and communicate in secret. Just as the medieval townsfolk might have whispered coded messages in dark alleys or through hidden symbols, members of resistance movements in the 20th century used encrypted radio transmissions, covert meetings, and underground publications to organize and fight back. The survival of both types of groups relied on the same fundamental principle: trust within a close-knit circle of allies and an unwavering commitment to the cause. The networks themselves were often composed of ordinary people, farmers, laborers, teachers, just as medieval survival networks had been. These were not grand generals or world-famous figures, but everyday men and women who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to undermine the occupying forces, whether it was the French under Nazi control or the European Jews fighting back against oppression. Just as medieval survival networks often relied on local healers or tradesmen, the resistance movements of later periods were often led by those with knowledge of their local terrain, their people, and the secrets of their own communities. Yet, the evolution of these underground networks was not confined to wartime. They also took on new forms during periods of political upheaval, revolution, and social unrest. In the 18th century, the American and French revolutions were fueled, in part, by underground cells of resistance that operated in secret. In both instances, the revolutionaries who sought to overthrow tyrannical rule used methods eerily similar to the medieval survival networks: hidden meeting places, secret codes, and an intense reliance on trust between individuals who risked their lives for a shared goal. As the concept of resistance grew more organized, so too did the complexity of these networks. The underground became a space where not just survival, but revolution itself was quietly planned. Even as we move into the modern era, the remnants of these medieval survival networks persist. In many ways, the rise of modern-day activism, particularly in authoritarian regimes, can be seen as a continuation of these age-old strategies. From the fight against oppressive governments in the Middle East to the rise of protest movements in the 21st century, the methods of communication and organization that were born out of medieval survival systems have remained remarkably consistent. In today's digital age, where information can be both a weapon and a tool of resistance, the same principles apply. The need for secrecy, the importance of trust, and the value of covert organization remain as essential as ever. The resilience of these underground networks is not just a matter of surviving external threats, it is about resisting them, actively working against the forces that seek to control or destroy. The very notion of survival has evolved into something far more complex. It is not just about enduring hardship, but actively fighting against oppressive systems. Whether through clandestine meetings in dimly lit rooms or encrypted communications transmitted across the globe, these networks continue to be the quiet force behind movements that strive for justice, freedom, and change. This legacy, deeply rooted in the medieval world, is not something that has been left behind in history. It is a living, breathing thread that runs through the very fabric of our modern struggles. As we continue our exploration, we will look more closely at how these survival networks functioned day to day, how they communicated in secrecy, and how they remained hidden even as they shaped the course of history. This understanding of the mechanics behind the survival of these networks is crucial to comprehending their enduring influence. What if entire towns were built with secret tunnels, chambers, and hidden passageways, designed to keep their people alive without anyone ever knowing they existed? A simple, seemingly ordinary town could be more than it appeared. Beneath the surface, behind thick stone walls and hidden doors, lay a network of life-saving spaces that kept entire communities alive during the most desperate times. These hidden safe havens, underground bunkers, concealed chambers, secret cellars and passageways were not only essential for survival, but they were often the difference between life and death during sieges, plagues, or invasions. The genius behind these survival spaces lies in their quiet, invisible design. These hidden havens were carefully constructed to remain undetected, either by marauding invaders or even by the local authorities. Built during times of peace, often in churches, monasteries, or public buildings, these safe spaces served a dual purpose. They were hidden reserves, meant for the survival of the town in times of crisis, and they were secret refuges that provided shelter to those fleeing danger. Over the years, they became an unspoken part of the fabric of medieval life, so integrated into the community that they passed into obscurity once the immediate dangers had passed. Yet, these survival systems formed the very backbone of a town's ability to endure. The architectural design of these safe havens was as practical as it was secretive. Townsfolk and their leaders understood that a visible, easily accessible refuge would be discovered too quickly. Therefore, many of these bunkers and chambers were concealed within existing buildings, often in plain sight. Churches, with their towering spires and thick stone walls, made ideal locations. Beneath the sanctuary, or hidden behind altars, secret doors led to underground chambers that could house food supplies, medical equipment, and even families. Monasteries were another prime example of these cleverly concealed havens. The stone buildings, once designed for worship and quiet reflection, were converted into self-sustaining fortresses. Here, hidden rooms in the cellars were dug out for the storage of grain, salt, and medicinal herbs, resources that would be crucial in times of famine or disease. Perhaps one of the most ingeniously designed features of these secret havens was the use of pre-existing infrastructure. Many towns relied on subterranean passageways that linked key points of the town, such as the town square, church, or castle. These passageways often started as simple sewer systems or water channels, but over time they were expanded and reinforced, becoming hidden routes that allowed survivors to move undetected. These passages also allowed townspeople to escape when the town's defenses were overrun. Without these secret tunnels, the risk of being trapped or captured was far too high. The construction of these passageways involved painstaking attention to detail, ensuring they could withstand the wear and tear of time and the forces that might seek to destroy them. One of the most fascinating aspects of these hidden havens was their resilience against physical threats. Siege weapons, like battering rams or trebuchets, could tear down even the strongest fortifications, but the hidden rooms and tunnels were built with materials that could withstand much more than stone walls could. The floors were lined with thick layers of clay or stone, designed to resist flooding or the heat from fire. Some of these secret chambers were even reinforced with lead or metal plates, which could absorb the impact of arrows or projectiles fired from catapults. These careful decisions made it possible for towns to stockpile essential resources, like food, water, and weapons resources, that could withstand both time and physical attack. The secret chambers weren't just hidden, they were also incredibly durable, ensuring that they remained intact long enough for the community to regroup and survive. Archaeological discoveries have helped to reveal the ingenuity behind these safe havens. Excavations of medieval towns and castles have uncovered hidden rooms that were once used as storage or refuge. In some cases, entire networks of underground tunnels have been uncovered, some of which have not been disturbed for centuries. The layouts of these tunnels and hidden rooms reveal the complex planning that went into these survival strategies. They were never built haphazardly. Each space was carefully considered to ensure it could serve multiple functions. to store vital supplies, to protect families, and to provide a means of escape when all else failed. But these safe havens were not just places of refuge, they were also places of organization. When town leaders knew a crisis was coming, these underground spaces became the command centers of survival. It was in these hidden spaces that the crucial decisions were made: who to trust, how to allocate resources, when to fight, and when to hide. These chambers were the silent architects of the town's survival, where strategy, knowledge, and resourcefulness converged. As we peel back the layers of these survival havens, it's clear that their role in medieval survival networks was far more than just a place to hide. They were central to the very existence of the town in times of crisis. In a world where external forces could destroy everything in an instant, these hidden spaces were a town's last hope. And while we may never know the full extent of the underground systems in every town, the few examples that remain speak volumes about the foresight, resourcefulness, and courage of those who created them. Having laid out how these safe havens were constructed, it's time to turn our attention to how these spaces were used. They were not just shelters or hiding places. They were hubs of survival, storing critical resources like food, water, medicine, and weapons. These resources were the lifeblood of the underground survival systems. In the next section, we will explore how towns managed their resources within these hidden spaces, and how the networks that grew around these havens were sustained through the distribution of critical supplies. These hidden rooms and passageways were not just about survival. They were about keeping life going, even when everything outside seemed destined to collapse. In times of crisis, survival isn't just about hiding away or fortifying walls. The true secret to enduring through prolonged hardship lies in how well essential resources are managed, rationed, and distributed. Medieval survival networks understood this concept deeply, and their success often depended not just on hidden spaces, but on how those spaces were used to store and protect vital resources: food, water, medicine, tools, and weapons. These networks were often invisible to outsiders, with supplies carefully hidden and maintained through sophisticated, covert systems that kept everything out of view from invaders and authorities alike. How did communities secretly stockpile food, medicine, and weapons without their oppressors ever finding out, and what hidden systems kept it all from falling apart? The first and most obvious challenge was food. In times of siege or plague, traditional food sources were often cut off, crops failed, trade routes were blocked, and the very act of sourcing food became a dangerous endeavor. To ensure survival, townspeople had to develop clever methods of storage and rationing that would not only last but go undetected. Grain, salted meats, dried vegetables, and preserved fruits were common staples stored in these hidden spaces. But it wasn't just about quantity. It was about maintaining the integrity of these resources for as long as possible. Townsfolk often used clever concealment techniques to hide their stockpiles. One of the most ingenious methods involved the use of seemingly ordinary household items: boxes, chests, and barrels that could be moved or altered to create secret compartments. These storage spaces were hidden behind false walls, beneath floorboards, or even buried beneath the town's surface in hidden tunnels. The key to their effectiveness was not only the location, but also the unassuming nature of these spaces. To any casual observer, the room might look like any other. The hidden stores were camouflaged to blend in with their surroundings. Only those entrusted with the knowledge of these spaces knew how to access them. But it wasn't just about keeping supplies out of sight, it was also about keeping track of them. In times of scarce resources, rationing was critical. To maintain control and ensure no one took more than their share, communities often implemented sophisticated systems of record-keeping, sometimes using coded messages or symbols to track what was available and what had been consumed. Trusted individuals, often the town's leaders or a small group of community organizers, were responsible for ensuring that the right amount of food was distributed to the right people at the right time. These figures had a dual role. They managed the flow of resources while also preventing panic or hoarding. Water, another essential resource, posed a different challenge. When towns were cut off from external supplies, finding and maintaining access to water became crucial. In some towns, secret wells were dug, hidden away in places only a few knew about. These wells were not just sources of drinking water. They were often used to sustain hidden food caches or even secret refuges. The very location of these wells was a tightly held secret, known only to a select group. In larger towns or cities, it was common to find subterranean water channels that fed into these underground havens. The people who maintained these secret water sources were usually the same individuals responsible for securing other resources, ensuring that not only were they safe from external threats, but that their basic needs were always met. Medicine, too, was a critical part of survival. In a world plagued by diseases, injury, and famine, the ability to treat wounds, alleviate sickness, and manage illnesses was essential. But accessing medicines and medical supplies in the open was dangerous. Healers, many of whom were viewed with suspicion by the authorities, had to rely on secrecy. They kept their herbs, poultices, and tonics hidden away in safe locations, often within the very same rooms where food and water were stored. These medical supplies were just as crucial as weapons or food, as illness could wipe out entire populations if left unchecked. Sometimes, these supplies were brought in from other towns or from secret trading networks that existed outside the knowledge of the ruling authorities. The most subtle and perhaps most important aspect of the survival economy was the psychological element. Communities that survived depended on something more than just physical resources. They depended on trust. In times of extreme hardship, when suspicion was high and the outside world seemed filled with threats, the people within these hidden networks had to rely on an unspoken bond of mutual aid. The knowledge that the community had each other's backs created a sense of unity that was just as vital as any material resource. People shared what they had, not out of charity, but out of necessity. The secret networks relied on cooperation, the willingness to help one another without asking for anything in return, knowing that their survival was intertwined. But trust, especially in such dangerous times, was fragile. It required the right balance of secrecy and openness. Only those who had proven their loyalty and resourcefulness were brought into the fold. A slip of the tongue, a careless mistake, or an outsider gaining access to critical information could destroy everything. The secret economy was a delicate web, strong when intact, but fragile and prone to unraveling with even the smallest betrayal. The survival of these communities hinged on the ability to keep their networks intact, even when external pressure seemed too great. The ingenuity of these underground survival systems is something that has often been overlooked by historians. But when we dig deeper, we see how crucial they were in ensuring that towns could endure the worst crises in history. These systems weren't just about surviving, they were about thriving, even in the face of total destruction. And while many of these hidden networks may have faded from history, their lessons in resource management, trust, and survival continue to resonate today. Having explored how these resources were managed and distributed, we now turn to the next critical element of these survival networks: communication. How did people remain connected, share information, and organize their efforts without revealing the location of their precious resources? In the next section, we will dive into the covert communication methods that kept these networks functioning under the radar, ensuring that their survival strategies remained hidden from those who sought to destroy them. What if you had to rely on coded messages and secret symbols to stay alive, and the wrong word could cost you everything? In times of crisis, survival wasn't just about securing food or hiding in the shadows. It was about communication. The art of speaking without being heard, of sharing critical information without alerting anyone who could exploit it, became a matter of life and death. Medieval survival networks thrived not only on hidden spaces and resources, but on covert communication systems, silent exchanges of vital intelligence that could mean the difference between life and annihilation. The first rule of any survival network was secrecy. If even a single person knew too much, everything could unravel. Entire communities, hidden beneath layers of secrecy, depended on systems of covert communication that allowed them to share information, coordinate actions, and issue warnings without ever raising suspicion. These methods were as varied as the towns they protected, tailored to fit the environment and the threats they faced. For some, this meant using simple codes. For others, it meant creating elaborate languages that could only be understood by a few trusted individuals. Perhaps the most striking feature of these communication methods was the use of symbols and codes. In a world where the wrong word could give you away, language itself became a tool of survival. Messages were often written in codes, sequences of letters, numbers, or symbols that held secret meanings known only to a select group of individuals. Townsfolk would carve symbols into walls, mark trees with chalk, or arrange objects in specific patterns to convey messages without speaking. These symbols were so subtle that they often went unnoticed by the untrained eye, allowing towns to exchange critical information under the noses of the occupying forces. One of the most fascinating examples of this form of communication is the use of hand signals during sieges. Soldiers and townspeople would develop a series of gestures that could convey information over long distances without the need for spoken words. These hand signals were simple but effective. A raised hand might signal that danger was near, while a specific wave of the arm could indicate the need for help or the readiness to move supplies. These gestures were used in times of extreme pressure, when speaking out loud could alert enemies to their location. A single, subtle motion was enough to communicate a vital piece of information, and this silent language kept the people connected in ways that the outside world never saw. Perhaps even more covert than hand signals were the methods used to communicate when a messenger had to travel from one safe point to another. In many cases, towns relied on a small group of trusted individuals, often known only to a handful of people, to carry these messages. These messengers were crucial to the survival of the network. Their discretion, loyalty, and ability to avoid detection made them the lifeblood of the underground communication system. Some of these messengers traveled in disguise, posing as ordinary villagers, while others took to the streets only under cover of darkness. Regardless of their method, the trust placed in these individuals was absolute. They were the ones who ensured that critical information reached the right people at the right time. The wrong messenger, or a moment of indiscretion, could destroy the entire network. During times of siege, when entire towns were cut off from the outside world, communication was even more vital. The ability to convey plans for evacuation, to warn of a brewing threat, or to secretly move resources could make or break a town's resistance. Secret messages were often hidden in everyday items beneath the soles of shoes, inside hollowed-out bread loaves, or sewn into the linings of jackets. At times, even invisible ink was used to encode messages. This seemingly magical method of writing allowed letters to be sent without being visible until the right chemical solution was applied, making it a perfect tool for covert communication. Even seemingly harmless letters or drawings could hold encrypted messages that carried information vital to the survival of the town. The ingenuity of these systems was matched only by their adaptability. As external threats evolved, whether through changing political landscapes, shifting alliances, or new technological advancements, these communication systems grew more complex. In fact, many of the codes used by medieval survival networks were designed with this evolution in mind. New methods of encryption were constantly created, often inspired by the constant threat of detection. Just as invaders learned to intercept and decipher messages, the people working in secret found ways to stay one step ahead. These codes and signs were not just about survival, they were about maintaining hope. In a world where everything felt uncertain, where the only constants were siege and starvation, these networks kept the spirit of resistance alive. By using these covert systems, communities remained connected even when the outside world seemed beyond reach. The trust that these networks depended on was more than just practical. It was emotional and psychological, reinforcing the idea that they were all in this together, even if they couldn't speak freely. Yet, the reliance on secrecy was a double-edged sword. Trust could be both a strength and a vulnerability. When a trusted messenger was captured, or when a message was misinterpreted, the results could be catastrophic. The wrong word, the wrong symbol, or a careless slip of the tongue could destroy everything. In these moments, the survival of the entire network depended not just on the systems they had built, but on the discretion and loyalty of a few key individuals. These individuals, often working in isolation, became the unsung heroes of the network's silent warriors, whose efforts were crucial to keeping the system intact. As we look at the evolution of these covert communication systems, it becomes clear that they were not just reactive measures. They were proactive systems, designed to maintain the integrity of the network at all costs. These silent methods of communication formed the backbone of underground survival systems, ensuring that messages could be passed, plans could be made, and hope could be kept alive even in the darkest of times. Now that we understand the systems of communication that allowed these networks to survive, we turn our attention to how they extended their reach beyond individual towns. How did these secret networks connect with larger regional movements, creating an even broader web of survival and resistance? The next section will explore the broader impact of these survival networks, showing how they evolved into complex systems that spanned entire regions and even nations. Could entire regions have been secretly connected through underground survival networks, one hand helping the other without the knowledge of the authorities? It may seem improbable, yet history reveals that such networks existed. quietly spreading from one town to the next, uniting villages, towns, and even cities under a common cause: survival. When the world around them seemed to crumble under the weight of war, famine, or disease, these networks provided the structure and support that kept entire regions from falling apart. In times of crisis, the survival of an isolated town or village depended on more than just the resources it could secure within its walls. As medieval Europe was ravaged by repeated wars, the Black Death, and famine, the need for cooperation grew. What began as a series of local survival efforts eventually expanded into a regional network, interconnected systems that spanned broader landscapes. These systems often operated under the radar, outside the purview of kings and rulers, forging alliances and mutual aid agreements that were vital to sustaining communities. Without these hidden alliances, entire regions could have easily been overrun or left to starve. The concept of regional survival networks emerged as larger towns and cities served as hubs for smaller, more vulnerable communities. Think of a vast web of interconnections, where a well-established town would offer shelter and support to neighboring villages, guiding them through moments of crisis. Larger cities, with their stronger defenses, better access to resources, and more organized structures, became the focal points of these underground survival systems. They not only coordinated the supply of food, medicine, and information, but also acted as safe havens for refugees from smaller towns that had been overwhelmed by sieges, disease, or starvation. In return, smaller towns and villages that survived through these networks played a crucial role by providing resources or intelligence, thus contributing to the survival of the entire region. For example, one village might be the primary source of grain, while another provided medicinal herbs or the knowledge of how to preserve food during long winters. These contributions formed the foundation of the broader network, where each individual town became a vital cog in a larger, self-sustaining mechanism. How did these regional networks grow so effectively? Much of it came down to trust, an essential element in any survival system. As towns faced external threats, their residents realized that survival didn't just depend on the resources they could store, but on the relationships they built with their neighbors. Trust was forged over time, and word of successful survival tactics traveled through these connected communities. Over time, these methods, often passed down through oral tradition or written records in the form of coded messages, became the foundation of a regional strategy for survival. For instance, there are records of towns in the south of France during the 100 Years' War, sending messages of warning to towns to the north, advising them of impending raids or military threats. The networks of communication allowed these towns to prepare ahead of time, to hide supplies, or to evacuate vulnerable populations. They worked as one unified group, even when the surrounding world seemed on the verge of collapse. These regional networks also relied heavily on alliances, pacts forged between neighboring towns or even distant regions. One of the most intriguing aspects of these alliances was how they often transcended political boundaries. Towns and villages might form agreements for mutual defense or resource sharing, not based on the feudal loyalties that would normally define medieval politics, but on the shared necessity for survival. These pacts were often kept secret, known only to the leaders or a select group within the towns. The arrangements were typically informal, based more on mutual trust than formal contracts, which made them far harder to dismantle. For example, during the Black Death, some regions in Italy formed agreements to help one another by sending food, medicine, and even trained doctors between towns. These towns knew that isolation would doom them. If they couldn't help each other, they would fall one by one. These underground support systems allowed many to hold on longer than they otherwise would have. These alliances weren't just based on food or military defense, they were about sharing knowledge. A town that had developed methods to prevent the spread of disease, for example, would share those methods with neighboring towns, helping the entire region survive longer. The importance of these regional networks can be seen in the aftermath of major events like sieges. After towns like Alindra held out during a siege, they didn't just go back to normal life. Instead, the lessons learned, the resources stored, and the relationships formed during the siege became a central part of the region's broader survival strategies. The more these networks grew, the more they evolved into complex structures, resembling a hidden society where information, resources, and even military strength were shared across communities. These networks even extended beyond what we traditionally think of as survival. They were also vehicles for social cohesion and the preservation of culture. In times when the external world was harsh and hostile, The bonds forged in these survival networks kept towns alive, but also kept communities connected. These connections allowed people to maintain a sense of identity, even when their physical surroundings had been ravaged by war or disease. Shared religious practices, festivals, and communal work helped to keep the spirits of the survivors intact, even when everything else was falling apart. The secrecy of these networks ensured that, for the most part, the authorities were kept in the dark. Towns that were supposedly under control by rulers often operated outside of their reach, building and sustaining these networks without permission. While kings and lords sought to consolidate power and control resources, these underground networks operated outside the formal channels, slipping under the radar of their rulers. This often meant that even larger political movements had little insight into the survival strategies that were being implemented on the ground. By the time the medieval period gave way to the early modern era, these networks had become not just a lifeline but a lasting part of the social fabric. The survival tactics developed in these regions didn't just help in times of immediate crisis, they laid the groundwork for resistance movements, secret societies, and revolutionary uprisings that would follow. The ability to coordinate, hide resources, and work covertly across regions would become invaluable during periods of political upheaval in later centuries. Having explored how these networks expanded regionally, the next step is to look at how they reached national levels. How did these survival networks intersect with larger political movements, and how did their influence ripple through entire kingdoms? In the next section, we'll dive into how the survival systems that began at a local level were the very foundation of resistance movements that changed the course of nations. What if the underground survival networks that kept people alive were also the very ones that toppled oppressive rulers and sparked revolutions? In the shadows of medieval kingdoms, where political power was often concentrated in the hands of kings, lords, and invaders, there existed a hidden force that would eventually shape the course of history. These survival networks, born out of necessity, evolved into something far more powerful than mere survival strategies. They became active political forces, quietly organizing rebellion, smuggling dissidents, and sheltering those who were persecuted by the authorities. In times of political unrest, these underground systems of resistance became crucial to the fight against tyranny and oppression. They were not passive entities, waiting for disaster to strike. They actively opposed the ruling power structures, challenging the very foundations of feudalism and monarchy. And they did so with remarkable efficiency and secrecy, operating far below the radar of the authorities who sought to control every aspect of life. The evolution of these networks into political forces began in response to widespread abuses of power. In medieval societies, where monarchies and feudal lords held absolute authority, the common folk were often at the mercy of those in power. Heavy taxation, land seizures, and the constant threat of violence were everyday realities. The church, too, often played a role in oppressing the lower classes, wielding significant power and influence over both political and social structures. Faced with such dire conditions, the people began to look for ways to resist, to fight back without directly confronting the ruling powers. And so, the survival networks that had originally been formed for simple protection from invaders or famine began to transform into covert political entities. One of the most striking examples of these networks as political forces is seen during times of revolt. Take, for example, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 England. The revolt was sparked by oppressive taxation and the harsh conditions of feudal life. While the rebels took to the streets, demanding justice and an end to the exploitation of the nobility, many of them had been part of larger underground networks of resistance. These networks, built in secrecy, had long been providing information, organizing support, and ensuring that rebels were hidden from the authorities before the revolt erupted into open conflict. The same secret channels that had hidden dissidents from the law now helped to coordinate a rebellion that would shake the foundations of the English monarchy. Similarly, during the late medieval period, when invading forces threatened the stability of entire regions, survival networks often became the front line of resistance. Towns and villages that had long been fortified with secret passageways and hidden supplies found themselves in a position to organize against invaders. Local populations, with no official military structure or political power, would turn to these underground networks to mount resistance against foreign armies. Covert messages were sent across borders, forming alliances between regions that were otherwise divided by language, culture, or politics. These alliances were not formalized with treaties or banners of war. They were instead the quiet workings of survival networks that communicated in secret, using coded messages and hidden symbols to coordinate their efforts. In these cases, the survival networks didn't just ensure the survival of the people, they became the organizing force behind resistance to foreign domination. The rise of these underground systems of resistance wasn't limited to physical defense. They also became crucial in the protection of persecuted minorities. One of the most profound examples of this is the role survival networks played in protecting religious minorities, particularly during times of religious persecution. Whether it was Jews during the Crusades or heretics during the Inquisition, underground networks formed to protect those who were targeted for their beliefs. These networks provided refuge for religious minorities, often sheltering them in remote villages, monasteries, or secret spaces beneath the cities. They organized safe passages for those who were being hunted, smuggling them to distant lands where they could live in relative safety. In some cases, these networks didn't just protect, they actively resisted. During the Albigensian Crusade in the 13th century, for example, the Cathars, a religious group deemed heretical by the Catholic Church, faced extermination by the French crown. In response, the Cathars and their sympathizers formed intricate underground networks that allowed them to survive the initial onslaught. These networks were not just hiding places, they were places of rebellion. They distributed pamphlets, held secret meetings, and provided the resources needed to continue their resistance against the Church and the monarchy. Even after the fall of the Cathar strongholds, these underground systems of resistance continued to operate in the shadows, providing sanctuary to those who fought for the preservation of their beliefs. The political power of these survival networks didn't just lie in their ability to protect or resist. Over time, they became the backbone of larger revolutionary movements, particularly as the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance and beyond. The same tactics of secret communication, resource management, and alliance building were used by resistance movements in later centuries. Whether it was the revolts against monarchies in France, the Italian city-states' battles for independence, or the growing cries for freedom during the Reformation, the underground survival networks provided the structure and organization for these movements. Their ability to work outside the official systems of power gave these networks a unique advantage. They could organize without attracting the attention of authorities, and they could operate in places where the ruling powers were too weak or too distracted to maintain control. The survival networks knew how to hide in plain sight, using the very systems of society to subvert and challenge it. The secrecy that had once ensured their survival during times of famine or war now became the tool that allowed them to reshape the political landscape of entire regions. In these ways, underground networks evolved from simple systems of survival to powerful engines of political resistance. They became a force for change, undermining established power structures, smuggling revolutionaries across borders, and protecting the oppressed from violent forces. What started as a means of staying alive became a way of challenging and ultimately dismantling the systems of oppression that had governed medieval society. Having examined the political implications of these survival networks, it's time to delve deeper into how these networks interacted with and were shaped by religious and spiritual movements. The relationship between faith, secrecy, and survival was a complex one, and in the next section, we will explore how these elements intertwined, creating a powerful force that not only sustained these networks, but propelled them forward in times of crisis. How did faith, often intertwined with secrecy, help the medieval survival networks endure the darkest of times, providing not just shelter, but a spiritual foundation for resistance? The medieval world was, in many ways, defined by its devotion to religion. Whether through Christianity, other belief systems, or localized spiritual practices, faith was woven into the very fabric of everyday life. And in times of crisis, when kingdoms fell, plagues raged, and wars ransacked, the land religion was not only a moral compass, but a tool for survival. Faith provided more than a path to salvation. It became the bedrock upon which many of the medieval survival networks were built. Religious institutions, such as monasteries, churches, and hermitages, often became sanctuaries during periods of political or military upheaval. These were not just places of worship, they were also refuges, havens for those fleeing persecution, or spaces where hidden networks of survival took root. Monasteries, with their isolated locations and vast resources, were particularly important. They offered shelter to those in danger, not only from physical threats like invading armies or local authorities, but from social persecution. Religious figures, whether monks, priests, or hermits, were frequently at the heart of these survival systems. While they were often viewed as pillars of their communities, these individuals also played key roles in organizing, protecting, and guiding the underground survival networks that kept towns and villages alive. Religious figures provided not just physical shelter, but psychological and emotional support. In a world where uncertainty ruled, where death and destruction loomed large, the faith that these figures offered became a lifeline. When people fled their homes, seeking refuge in hidden places, it was often these spiritual leaders who provided the comfort of prayer, the strength of communal belief, and the promise of divine protection. Their presence gave people a sense of purpose, something to hold on to when all seemed lost. In times when the world felt cruel and unrelenting, faith provided hope, something that was crucial for survival in the face of death. Moreover, religious figures were often tasked with maintaining the secret networks themselves. They had access to hidden places within their institutions, whether caves beneath monasteries, crypts beneath churches, or walled-off chambers, where essential resources were stored and where persecuted individuals could take refuge. The deep trust between these spiritual leaders and their communities allowed these underground systems to thrive. It wasn't just about food, weapons, or information. It was about the belief that survival, even in the darkest times, was part of a divine plan. But the connection between religion and survival networks went far beyond shelter and protection. Many of these hidden survival systems relied on symbols, rituals, and texts that were deeply embedded in religious traditions. Secret religious symbols, such as cryptic inscriptions, markings on walls, or the use of coded prayers, served as part of the communication systems within these networks. For example, a simple cross carved into a doorframe could indicate that a particular home was a safe haven for fugitives. Or a phrase from scripture could be passed between trusted individuals to signify a call for help or a message of support. These symbols were as much a part of the underground economy as the food stores hidden in cellars. In some cases, entire texts were encoded with hidden meanings to ensure the safety of their contents. Religious texts, particularly those that might be seen as heretical or subversive by the authorities, were often safeguarded in secret. These texts weren't just spiritual guides, they contained forbidden knowledge, maps to hidden refuges, and instructions for survival. Monks would carefully transcribe these texts, often using invisible ink or concealed within layers of more innocuous writings. To an outsider, a prayer book or a Bible might appear entirely unremarkable. But to those in the know, it could be a map to the next secret meeting or a guide to evading capture. Faith itself, too, became a powerful tool of resistance. The belief in divine intervention was often a driving force behind these survival networks. Communities could hold on to the belief that God or the gods would protect them through their trials, even when everything else seemed to be falling apart. The moral duty to protect others and preserve life during times of oppression was often rooted in religious teachings, creating a framework for action that transcended mere survival. These acts of resistance, whether hiding refugees, sabotaging enemy forces, or gathering information to thwart oppressors, were framed as a higher calling. The fight for survival wasn't just about staying alive, it was about staying true to a divine purpose. This connection between faith and survival reached its peak during moments of great peril. During the Crusades, for example, religious persecution often forced entire communities to take up arms in defense of their beliefs. But the resistance wasn't always physical. It could be intellectual or spiritual. In cases where military resistance was impossible, communities turned inward, relying on their faith to preserve their values and way of life. The faith that these groups held in one another and in their belief in divine justice was an unshakable force that bound them together, even as the world around them seemed to collapse. Perhaps the most striking example of faith as a pillar of survival networks comes from the stories of religious minorities who faced mass persecution. Jewish communities in medieval Europe, for instance, often relied on their faith and religious networks to survive against systematic efforts to exterminate them. When communities were targeted by crusaders or other forces, it wasn't just physical survival that was at stake, it was the survival of an entire belief system. Jewish networks, often working in the shadows, provided sanctuary, forged alliances, and carried on their cultural traditions in secret. Their religious devotion provided them with the strength to endure unimaginable hardships, even as entire communities were wiped out. The role of faith in these survival networks highlights a profound aspect of human resilience. Faith provided a moral framework for survival and resistance. It offered hope, motivation, and direction during times when the external world seemed to offer nothing but suffering. It was not simply the physical structures of monasteries or churches that kept people alive. It was the belief in something greater than themselves that sustained these communities through even the most harrowing circumstances. As we move forward, we will explore how this survival knowledge was preserved and passed down, even when formal institutions sought to erase it. The preservation of knowledge, whether religious, practical, or philosophical, became an essential element of survival. In the next section, we'll examine the secret education systems that allowed forbidden knowledge to continue across generations, ensuring that survival strategies and resistance methods could endure through the ages. What if the most valuable knowledge of the medieval world was never taught in schools, but passed down secretly hidden away from the authorities who sought to erase it? The medieval period, with its constant threat of war, famine, and disease, was a time when survival wasn't just about physical strength. It was about knowledge hidden, forbidden knowledge. This knowledge, often passed down through underground networks, contained the secrets to survival that could keep entire communities alive in times of crisis. Yet, it was also dangerous, subversive, and often too powerful for public dissemination. Throughout the medieval world, certain skills and pieces of wisdom were considered too potent to be shared openly. The ruling powers, be they monarchs, feudal lords, or the church, understood that knowledge was power. In times of crisis, the ability to heal the sick, preserve food for winter, or strategize military defense could make the difference between life and death. As a result, many of these vital survival techniques were kept hidden, passed down only through trusted individuals or secret networks. The survival strategies that allowed towns to endure long sieges, plagues, or invasions were often concealed from the authorities, preserved within communities that had learned to protect them at all costs. Some of the most valuable forbidden knowledge centered around medical practices. In an era when disease could decimate populations overnight, the knowledge of how to cure illnesses or treat wounds was of paramount importance. Yet, much of this knowledge was considered dangerous, often suppressed by the Church, which deemed many medical practices to be heretical or sinful. Herbal remedies, which had been passed down through generations of healers, were one of the most closely guarded aspects of this forbidden knowledge. Healers, often viewed with suspicion, knew how to use plants and herbs to treat ailments that modern medicine was helpless against. The use of plants like sage, garlic, or willow bark, which could soothe pain, heal wounds, or fight infections, were essential to survival. This knowledge was often passed on secretly, through whispered teachings or hidden manuscripts that could be easily destroyed by authorities. In addition to healing, there were other crucial survival tactics that were kept secret. Methods of food preservation, such as curing, drying, and salting meat, were techniques that allowed towns to withstand famine and siege. These methods were closely guarded by the townsfolk who practiced them, for if their secrets were discovered by invaders or rulers, it would strip them of their ability to sustain themselves during times of crisis. Similarly, agricultural techniques, ways to grow food in the harshest of conditions, were passed down in secrecy, shared only with those who could be trusted. The knowledge of how to grow crops in poor soil, how to store grain for long periods, or how to cultivate medicinal plants was essential for survival during times of war or pestilence. These secrets were also highly practical, extending to military strategies that had been honed over generations. As invaders or oppressive rulers laid siege to towns, survival often depended on the ability to resist and fight back. Secret military tactics, such as the use of underground passageways for quick escapes or the construction of hidden fortifications, were passed down through trusted soldiers and leaders. One of the most ingenious strategies was the creation of defensive structures that could withstand attacks while remaining hidden from the enemy. In some cases, towns created false fortifications, mock walls, and barriers that misled invaders about the true locations of the town's defenses. These tactics, perfected over time, became an invaluable part of the survival network, enabling communities to withstand not just physical attacks, but psychological ones as well. The preservation of this forbidden knowledge was often a matter of life and death. In some cases, these survival secrets were hidden in plain sight. Monasteries, with their vast libraries, became repositories for forbidden texts, writings on herbal medicine, military strategy, and secret religious practices. These texts were often hidden within layers of more innocuous books or written in code, so that even if a town's books were confiscated or destroyed, the knowledge would remain intact, In other cases, oral tradition was the primary method of passing down these secrets. Elders, healers, and military leaders would teach the younger generations the hidden knowledge, ensuring its survival in the face of potential erasure. They understood that this knowledge was not just a means of surviving a siege or an illness, it was a way to resist the forces that sought to control them. One of the most interesting and secretive methods of preserving and transmitting this knowledge was the use of coded language. Certain words or phrases were imbued with secret meanings known only to those within the network. A particular flower might symbolize a remedy, a gesture could indicate the need for aid, or a specific combination of numbers might point to a hidden cache of supplies. Even common objects, like a loaf of bread or a piece of cloth, could carry encoded messages that communicated vital information to the right person. This ability to communicate without speaking was essential for survival in a world where even the slightest mistake could lead to death. The secrecy surrounding this knowledge was not merely a precaution, it was a form of resistance. The very act of keeping certain survival strategies hidden from the authorities was a statement against control. These secret networks of knowledge were a challenge to the ruling powers, who sought to monopolize information and dictate how the people should live. By passing on this forbidden knowledge, these networks ensured that communities could withstand whatever external force sought to subdue them, whether it was a foreign army or an oppressive regime. What is perhaps most fascinating about this forbidden knowledge is how it was preserved for future generations. The very nature of secrecy ensured that these survival tactics would not be forgotten. In times when the authorities attempted to suppress such knowledge, the underground networks became the custodians of wisdom that had the power to change the course of history. They were the unsung heroes, passing on not just the practical skills of survival, but also the knowledge of resistance, the tactics of rebellion, and the courage to stand against overwhelming odds. Having explored the types of forbidden knowledge, the next step is to examine how this knowledge was passed down and protected. How did these networks ensure that the secrets of survival, the tactics of resistance, and the wisdom of their forebears were preserved and transmitted to future generations? In the next section, we will delve into the methods of secret education and the underground systems that maintained these vital teachings, even in the face of authorities determined to destroy them. What if the most valuable books of the medieval era were hidden in secret libraries, coded in ways only a few could understand, and never meant to be seen by the outside world? Beneath the surface of medieval society, away from the eyes of monarchs, bishops, and invading forces, there existed an entire network of hidden libraries and secret manuscripts, repositories of forbidden knowledge that were passed down in silence. These texts, stored in remote monasteries, private estates, and clandestine chambers, held the secrets of survival, medical treatments, agricultural techniques, military strategies, and wisdom that had the power to change the course of history. But this knowledge wasn't simply stored, it was carefully guarded and deliberately obscured to protect it from those who sought to control or erase it. These secret libraries were not public institutions. They were often private collections, hidden away in places that were not easily accessible. Monasteries, with their isolated locations and quiet sanctuaries, were prime places for this kind of hidden knowledge to take root. Often, these libraries contained manuscripts on practical survival skills, how to preserve food for long winters, how to heal the sick using natural remedies, and how to protect communities from external threats. For many people, especially in times of siege or plague, these texts were not just books, they were lifelines. Yet, the wisdom contained in them was never meant to be available to the masses. In fact, it was deliberately concealed, either through the obscurity of language, the use of coded writing, or the sheer isolation of the libraries themselves. The act of keeping knowledge secret was a necessity for survival, particularly for those who lived in a world where knowledge was power, and power was often used to oppress the very people who needed that knowledge the most. Religious authorities, in particular, viewed many of these texts as a threat to their control over the populace. Medical practices, for instance, were often at odds with the doctrines of the Church. Healing was a divine right, and anything that threatened the Church's monopoly over medicine could be seen as heretical. Similarly, agricultural techniques that could increase crop yield or improve food preservation were considered valuable trade secrets, secrets that needed to be kept hidden, lest the authorities catch wind of them and attempt to regulate or control them. As a result, many of these crucial texts were encoded or written in obscure languages known only to a select few. Invisible ink was one such method used to keep these books hidden. In a world where even a single word could condemn someone to death or ruin, invisible ink became an essential tool for survival. Important documents were often written in plain ink, but key portions of the text, such as instructions for surviving a siege, recipes for medicinal potions, or notes on political resistance, were written in invisible ink. Only those with access to the right chemicals or techniques could reveal the hidden messages. This method allowed the text to be safely stored without raising suspicion, all the while preserving their critical knowledge for future generations. But invisible ink was not the only method used to encode knowledge. Medieval survival texts were often written in highly symbolic or cryptic languages. These texts, whether they were medical treatises, agricultural guides, or philosophical works, were crafted with coded references that could only be understood by those initiated into the network. An herbal remedy might be described not by its common name but by a symbol or an ancient word that only a handful of people would recognize. Military strategies might be written in elaborate metaphors with references to religious texts or obscure legends that held special meaning for the readers but were meaningless to outsiders. In some cases, entire languages were created to protect the information within these texts. The use of obscure languages, such as Latin or Greek, allowed scholars to write about sensitive topics without fear of detection. For those outside the scholarly elite, these languages were impenetrable. Even within religious communities, only the most learned monks or clerics had access to these secret texts, and their knowledge was closely guarded. The texts themselves often contained not only practical advice, but also philosophical or spiritual ideas that were considered dangerous or subversive by the ruling powers. One of the most intriguing aspects of these hidden libraries was the way they were preserved. They were often passed down not through public institutions but through private, personal channels. When the authorities came searching for heretical books or forbidden knowledge, these texts were hidden away in secure, secret locations. Sometimes, the books were buried underground or hidden in the walls of monasteries, churches, or private estates. At other times, they were passed from one trusted person to another, usually through a system of apprenticeship, where knowledge was transmitted orally, alongside the written word. Those who held these manuscripts often passed them on to select apprentices, teaching them not only how to read the coded language, but also how to use the knowledge contained within these books to help their communities survive. The preservation of these secret libraries wasn't just about safeguarding the past, it was about ensuring that future generations could survive as well. Many of these texts were kept in families, passed down through generations, where they became part of a hidden tradition of survival. The descendants of those who had first protected these secrets became the custodians of knowledge, passing it down to the next generation. It wasn't just the physical act of hiding the books that was important, it was the act of ensuring that the knowledge contained within them would not be lost. These secret libraries and coded texts represent a key part of the medieval survival networks. They weren't just collections of knowledge, they were tools of resistance, weapons in a quiet war against oppression. The very act of preserving knowledge in the face of repression was an act of defiance. Each text, each coded manuscript, was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, an enduring force that could not be extinguished by the authorities who sought to control it. As we explore how this forbidden knowledge was passed down and kept secret, we see that the survival of these systems depended not just on secrecy, but on the continuity of knowledge. This hidden wisdom became the foundation for future resistance movements, for the survival of communities in times of crisis, and for the preservation of ideas that were considered too dangerous for the mainstream. In the next section, we will explore how this hidden knowledge, once safely guarded, was transmitted across generations through clandestine education systems and underground apprenticeship networks, ensuring that the survival of these crucial skills would continue to impact the course of history. What if the most valuable lessons of survival were taught in secret, passed down from master to apprentice in hidden corners of society, away from the eyes of the ruling class? In the medieval world, where literacy was scarce and formal education was often reserved for the elite, much of the essential survival knowledge was passed down covertly in quiet corners of society. With external threats looming, be it political oppression, disease, or invasion, those with the wisdom to survive had to protect that knowledge, ensuring it was transmitted in a way that could withstand the forces that sought to destroy it. And so, a secret educational system emerged, one that operated in the shadows, often disguised as religious or philosophical teaching, to preserve the skills necessary for survival. The medieval underground education system was not a formal school or academy, but a network of informal apprenticeships and secret teachings. These underground schools existed primarily in places where the authorities were less likely to look, within churches, monasteries, or secluded estates. It was here that trusted teachers, often healers, monks, or respected elders, took on apprentices to pass on their knowledge. What was taught in these hidden classrooms was vital for survival medical practices, herbal remedies, siege defense strategies, and the art of living off the land. Perhaps one of the most important aspects of this clandestine education was its reliance on mentorship. The teachers in these secret schools weren't simply sharing written texts or formal lectures, they were training a select few individuals in the essential skills required to survive in a world where danger was ever present. These teachers were often healers or religious figures, and their apprentices learned how to use the Earth's natural resources to treat illnesses, cure wounds, and preserve food. In an era when disease and starvation were constant threats, this knowledge was not just practical, it was life-saving. The secrecy of these schools was paramount. Knowledge, once it was shared, could be lost forever if the wrong people found out about it. The teachers and students involved in this underground education system were bound by a code of silence, often under strict oaths or religious vows to keep the teachings hidden from outsiders. This ensured that only those who were truly dedicated to preserving the knowledge were allowed to learn it. These apprenticeships were not for the faint of heart. They were reserved for those who showed promise and loyalty, and only a few would be chosen to carry on the teachings. One of the key aspects of these underground educational networks was their ability to adapt. In many cases, the knowledge being passed down was not written down in books. Such texts would have been too easily destroyed or seized. Instead, the skills were taught through hands-on practice, oral traditions, and the sharing of coded symbols and gestures. This allowed the knowledge to be transmitted without leaving a paper trail. For example, an apprentice might learn to identify a rare plant by its shape and scent, rather than by reading its name in a book. Similarly, a young military strategist might learn the art of siege defense not from a written manual, but through practical demonstrations and coded instructions. Another vital aspect of this underground education was its focus on survival in times of crisis. While much of medieval education focused on religious doctrine or formal knowledge, these secret schools emphasized real-world, practical skills that were critical during periods of hardship. For example, children of peasants or villagers might be taught how to forage for food, how to construct makeshift weapons for self-defense, or how to create shelters using minimal resources. These were not the subjects of traditional schooling, they were the skills necessary to endure in an unstable world. The role of religion in these secret educational systems cannot be understated. Religious institutions, such as monasteries, were often the primary venues for these teachings. While the church was a central power in medieval society, it was also a space where secret networks could flourish. Monks, cloistered away from the world, were often the keepers of knowledge, not just in terms of religious texts, but also in preserving the practical knowledge that society needed to survive. The secrecy of monastic life made it an ideal setting for the preservation of forbidden knowledge. However, these underground schools weren't just places of refuge for knowledge, they were also spiritual sanctuaries. Many of the teachings imparted within the walls of these hidden educational systems were grounded in faith. The belief that survival in such harsh conditions was part of a divine plan gave the teachings a higher purpose. Faith provided a strong foundation for those involved, offering not only the moral imperative to help one another, but also the psychological resilience needed to endure in times of oppression and danger. The trust that students and teachers placed in each other wasn't just about learning survival skills, it was also about a shared belief in something greater than themselves. In some cases, the teachings were more directly political. For instance, an oppressed group might use these underground educational systems to prepare for rebellion, subtly teaching tactics for resistance alongside survival skills. In a world where open rebellion could mean certain death, these hidden schools taught students how to outlast or outmaneuver their oppressors. Even within the teachings of military strategy, there were elements of rebellion, how to use knowledge of the land to escape enemy capture, how to forge alliances with neighboring communities, and how to disrupt the power structures that sought to control them. The secrecy surrounding these networks meant that they were often shielded from the broader political movements of the time. But even though these underground educational systems were kept hidden from the general populace, they were incredibly effective. Over time, they produced generations of individuals who were equipped not only with the survival skills needed for physical endurance, but with the resilience to resist the forces that sought to control them. What these underground education systems ultimately achieved was the preservation of critical survival knowledge, and a generation of people capable of enduring and resisting in times of crisis. These schools did not just teach survival, they taught defiance. And as the medieval world transitioned into the Renaissance and beyond, the knowledge passed down through these secretive educational systems became the foundation of future resistance movements, ensuring that the wisdom of survival was not lost to history. After examining the underground education systems that helped preserve this knowledge, we will now shift focus to how these networks adapted and evolved during times of external threats. When invaders or political upheaval pressed in, survival networks didn't just endure, they transformed, becoming more resilient and more strategic. This next section will explore how these networks functioned when they were most under pressure, and how they adapted to keep survival knowledge alive amidst growing external challenges. What if the secret survival networks that kept people alive during sieges also helped to secretly undermine invaders, turning the tables on those who thought they had conquered everything? The medieval period was a time of constant military conflict, with invaders ranging from the fearsome Viking raiders to the vast Mongol horde. These invasions brought devastation, tearing through cities and towns, leaving destruction and despair in their wake. However, beneath the surface of these violent upheavals, there existed a powerful hidden force: underground survival networks. These covert systems, built over centuries, adapted to the ever-changing threats of warfare, offering not only refuge but also resistance. In times of war, the traditional structures of society would often collapse, and survival became a matter of immediate concern. For those who were not part of the ruling class or military elite, the reality of invasion meant being at the mercy of the invaders. Towns were besieged, homes were burned, and whole populations were massacred. Yet, for those who had access to underground networks, there was a glimmer of hope. These networks became crucial for preserving life and maintaining the resources necessary for recovery after invasions. When cities were overrun, these networks sprang into action, guiding survivors to hidden shelters, providing essential food and medical supplies, and ensuring the survival of the most valuable individuals, those who had the knowledge, leadership, and skills needed to rebuild society. When Viking raiders attacked coastal towns, or when Mongol forces swept through Eastern Europe, the people within these underground networks activated emergency plans. In the case of Viking raids, for example, the Norsemen were known for their swift and brutal tactics, often striking towns by surprise. Communities that had established underground shelters beneath churches, homes, or even in the hills could quickly relocate, avoiding capture or death. These underground sanctuaries were not just safe from the physical threat of invading forces, they were also hidden from the looters who would scavenge what little remained after an attack. These secret places offered shelter and security to civilians and valuable members of society, such as healers, artisans, and intellectuals, ensuring that the skills and knowledge crucial for rebuilding were preserved. Similarly, during the Mongol invasions, when entire cities were razed, survival networks became lifelines for those who were able to escape the chaos. The Mongols, famous for their military prowess, would destroy cities and kill or enslave anyone who stood in their way. But for the survivors of these attacks, underground networks provided the necessary infrastructure for recovery. Food was stored in secret caches, and escape routes through hidden tunnels or disguised passageways were vital for getting people out of danger. The most resourceful survivors were often those who had been part of these hidden networks, people who knew where to go, who to trust, and how to stay one step ahead of the invading forces. But these underground networks didn't just passively protect civilians. In many cases, they actively resisted invaders, turning the tide of war through sabotage, espionage, and covert military tactics. As cities fell, the remnants of their defensive systems often relied on these networks to mount a form of resistance. Even in the most dire situations, when a town was on the verge of being overrun, small groups within these survival networks would quietly undermine the invaders by sabotaging supply lines, poisoning wells, or using secret signals to coordinate attacks on unsuspecting enemy forces. These small but powerful actions were a form of guerrilla warfare that disrupted the invaders' plans and slowed their advance. In some instances, the entire towns or villages used their underground networks to strike back against their conquerors. These networks allowed for rapid communication, enabling the coordination of attacks even after the town had been seized. By using hidden routes, messages would be sent to neighboring villages or towns that were not yet under attack. These messages often carried information about enemy movements, weaknesses, or the location of invader supply lines. Armed with this intelligence, neighboring communities could launch surprise attacks or sabotage enemy camps, creating confusion and halting the invaders' progress. The secret knowledge and skills that were passed down through these networks also provided a psychological advantage. During times of siege, when the morale of the population was at its lowest, the belief that there was still hope through escape routes, hidden supplies, and resistance efforts kept spirits alive. The very fact that survival networks existed, functioning as both shelters and resistance systems, bolstered the courage of those who would otherwise have resigned themselves to defeat. One example of how these survival networks provided resistance during an invasion can be found in the defense of the city of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. While the Crusaders besieged the city, local resistance networks, formed of both civilians and defenders, utilized underground routes and secretive military tactics to delay the invaders. The defenders of Constantinople, though vastly outnumbered, managed to use their knowledge of hidden passages and underground fortifications to stage guerrilla attacks and harass the Crusaders, buying valuable time for the civilians to escape. These types of resistance actions, often overlooked by traditional military history, were made possible because of the underground survival networks that had been carefully built over generations. When towns were overrun or destroyed, the survival networks didn't just fade away, they helped the survivors rebuild. After the devastation of invasions, the same hidden networks that had protected people during the siege would facilitate the rebuilding process. They would assist with organizing food distribution, rebuilding homes, and re-establishing social and economic structures. The networks also kept the survivors connected to broader regions, allowing for the exchange of resources, knowledge, and reinforcements. In this way, the underground systems played an integral role in the recovery process, helping to ensure that life could continue after the devastation. What makes these survival networks during invasions so remarkable is how they evolved to meet the demands of war. What began as simple shelters and protection systems became dynamic, active tools of resistance, capable of organizing and executing complex strategies to outmaneuver and disrupt invaders. The ability of these networks to remain hidden, adapt to external threats, and provide crucial resources long after the battle was won or lost is a testament to their resilience and ingenuity. Having explored the ways these networks adapted to military invasions, we will now examine how the broader political landscape influenced the survival networks. As medieval kingdoms and empires grew more centralized, these underground systems faced increasing pressure. In the next section, we'll look at how the expansion of empires, coupled with political upheavals, forced survival networks to evolve further, intertwining with larger political struggles and shaping the course of history. What if the very networks that kept towns alive during sieges and invasions were also the key to undermining oppressive political regimes, secretly fueling revolutions from the shadows? Throughout medieval Europe, political upheavals, power struggles, and the rise and fall of monarchies created a volatile landscape in which survival networks not only ensured the survival of the common people, but also became instruments of resistance against oppressive rulers. As new monarchs sought to consolidate their authority, many saw these underground systems as a threat to their control. Far from being passive, these networks became vital elements in supporting revolts, harboring dissidents, and undermining the existing political order. The medieval period was characterized by constant political shifts, monarchies rising and falling, empires fracturing, and feudal systems consolidating power. In this turbulent environment, those in power often viewed underground survival networks as subversive. These systems operated in secret, bypassing the traditional power structures. The rulers saw these networks as a challenge to their authority and legitimacy, and as such, sought to root them out. This led to an ongoing cat-and-mouse game between the authorities and the people who had built these covert systems of survival, resulting in a heightened sense of secrecy, resourcefulness, and resistance. Many monarchs and lords viewed the common people's reliance on these hidden networks as a threat because they undermined the ruler's ability to control the population. The nobility and the clergy, who held most of the power, feared that if these networks continued to grow and operate freely, they might inspire rebellion or, worse, outright insurrection. So, they took action seeking to destroy these survival networks or, at the very least, limit their influence. Secret police, spies, and informants were employed to infiltrate these networks, and laws were passed to outlaw any kind of secret organization that might challenge the authority of the crown or the church. Yet, despite these efforts to suppress them, survival networks became more resilient, more adaptive, and more crucial in times of political oppression. They were not simply concerned with survival in the face of military invasion. They also became vehicles for resistance, organizing people to push back against political control. When monarchs sought to consolidate power and enforce heavy taxation, for example, the underground networks became channels for rebellion, allowing communities to communicate and organize without being detected by the authorities. One of the most prominent examples of these underground networks playing a key role in resistance during political upheaval can be found in the aftermath of the 100 Years' War. As England and France fought for dominance, the common people in both countries endured immense hardships. In response to widespread poverty, oppression, and the devastation of war, underground movements began to grow. These networks provided the infrastructure for organized revolts, such as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 England. In the case of the Peasants' Revolt, survival networks weren't merely concerned with protecting people from the immediate dangers of war and famine. They were actively organizing and fueling rebellion. Leaders of the revolt communicated using secret networks, passing messages and organizing uprisings in remote villages far from the reach of the monarchy. The revolt itself was not a single, unified front. It was a series of decentralized, underground movements that had managed to keep their plans secret from the ruling authorities for months. These networks allowed for the protection and movement of key leaders, the distribution of resources, and the gathering of information to rally support against the oppressive feudal system. In addition to aiding revolts, survival networks also became sanctuaries for political dissidents. Those who opposed the monarchy, the church, or other established institutions often found refuge in these underground systems. For instance, during the Inquisition, religious reformers who challenged the church's authority found shelter in secret networks that hid them from the inquisitors. These networks not only provided physical protection, but also facilitated the transmission of forbidden ideas and literature. Underground pamphlets and writings, which were often censored or banned by the authorities, were distributed through covert channels, ensuring that these subversive ideas continued to spread, even in the face of intense repression. The rise of religious and political movements, such as the Protestant Reformation, further intertwined these underground survival networks with larger political struggles. As monarchs and religious authorities sought to control knowledge, resources, and populations, these networks became even more integral to the survival of dissidents. In regions where Protestant ideas were spreading, Catholic authorities often targeted those who refused to conform to the established religious order. Secret networks helped protect these heretics from capture and execution, while also providing the means to spread their revolutionary ideas in a clandestine manner. In this way, survival networks became more than just systems of protection. They were critical in fostering the ideological movements that would go on to reshape the political and religious landscape of Europe. While some monarchs attempted to suppress these networks, others saw them as valuable allies. During periods of political uncertainty or invasion, rulers who were otherwise consolidating power would occasionally form temporary alliances with these underground systems. These alliances were often pragmatic. The monarchs knew that they could use the networks to their advantage in times of crisis. For example, during the Crusades, many towns used their underground networks to smuggle information or resources to crusaders in distant lands. These secretive operations were not always done out of loyalty to the crown, but as part of the broader struggle for survival of both the town and its inhabitants. But this uneasy coexistence between rulers and the underground networks didn't always last. As soon as the external threats waned, or when monarchs felt secure in their power, the efforts to eliminate these secret systems would resume. The ruling class, recognizing the growing influence of these covert movements, would ramp up efforts to infiltrate and dismantle them, often using the same covert methods that had once been employed by the underground networks themselves. The political climate of medieval Europe, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the constant shift between monarchies and feudal systems, and the conflicts over religion and power created a volatile environment for survival networks. These systems not only adapted to survive external threats, they became essential in resisting and sometimes even overturning the very political forces that sought to control them. The persistence of these networks and their ability to thrive, even in the face of intense political and social upheaval, is a testament to the resilience of the common people who used them to carve out a space for survival and resistance. After examining the role of survival networks in shaping political struggles, we now turn to a broader question. How did these underground systems evolve in response to religious and philosophical ideologies? In the next section, we will explore how faith and belief systems intertwined with these networks, influencing survival strategies and further deepening the mystery and power of these secret movements. Could faith in divine protection have been the key to ensuring the survival of underground networks, guiding them through the darkest moments of medieval history? In medieval Europe, religion was more than just a personal belief system. It was a powerful force that shaped every aspect of society. From the everyday life of the common folk to the highest reaches of the monarchy, faith dictated not only personal morality, but social and political structures. In times of crisis, whether during sieges, invasions, plagues, or political upheavals, religious institutions became key players in survival networks. Monasteries, abbeys, and convents often offered more than spiritual refuge. They provided physical protection, medical assistance, and organized support for those in need. Faith in divine protection, paired with a strong sense of moral duty, became a cornerstone of survival during medieval hardship. Religious institutions were central to medieval society, and they played a paradoxical role in the lives of the people. On one hand, the church was a provider of stability, charity, and protection. Monasteries, for example, became sanctuaries for those seeking refuge during times of invasion, war, or persecution. They were places where people could find shelter, food, and medical care. Many monks, nuns, and clergy members were deeply involved in healing practices, and their knowledge of herbal medicine and remedies was often essential for survival in times of plague or illness. These institutions were also key in preserving knowledge, including survival techniques and ancient texts, which could be shared with those in need. On the other hand, the church itself often became an instrument of control. With its vast resources and reach, the church exerted significant political influence over the medieval population. For those seeking to subvert the existing order, whether it was the monarchies, foreign invaders, or oppressive local authorities, the church was a double-edged sword. While some members of the clergy supported the poor, the oppressed, or those in rebellion, others sought to suppress these underground movements, fearing their potential to destabilize the established social order. In some cases, religious authorities worked to suppress subversive underground networks, particularly those that challenged the hierarchical structures of power. This tension between the church as a protector and as a controller of society added a complex layer to the role of religion in medieval survival networks. Religious ideologies, particularly those concerning divine providence, also played a pivotal role in sustaining these networks during times of crisis. Apocalyptic beliefs were widespread during the medieval period, fueled by political instability, frequent invasions, and the terror of diseases like the Black Death. The idea that the world might be coming to an end was both terrifying and galvanizing. For those within survival networks, belief in divine protection during times of crisis became not just a source of comfort, but a motivating force. People believed that their survival was part of a divine plan, that their faith would shield them from harm and guide them through the darkest moments in history. This belief in divine providence was essential for the morale of those engaged in underground survival efforts. During long sieges or in the midst of plagues, communities would gather in churches or other religious sites, praying for divine intervention and protection. These gatherings were not just about spiritual solace, they were acts of defiance, reinforcing the community's resolve to survive against all odds. Religious faith imbued these survival networks with a sense of purpose and unity, making it easier to endure the hardships of war, famine, and disease. Those who were part of the underground movements often saw themselves as chosen, acting under divine guidance to protect their communities, resist invaders, or safeguard their way of life. Furthermore, religious ideology was often used as a framework to justify acts of resistance. When oppressive rulers sought to impose their will on the common people, faith-based narratives provided the moral justification for rebellion. In many cases, leaders of resistance movements would frame their struggles as a fight for divine justice. For example, during the peasant uprisings or revolts against foreign invaders, religious leaders would preach about the righteousness of their cause, invoking the idea that they were fighting not only for survival, but for a higher moral order. This helped to rally the population, creating a unifying belief that their actions were not just political, but divinely ordained. The role of faith in sustaining survival networks can also be seen in the way these networks were organized. Religious institutions often became the focal points for distributing resources, sharing knowledge, and organizing resistance efforts. Towns that had strong religious communities were more likely to have established survival networks that could withstand the pressure of sieges, invasions, or internal strife. The church often served as the intermediary between the common people and the ruling elite, providing support for those who had nowhere else to turn. In times of war or pestilence, it was the monasteries, churches, and religious orders that often coordinated the movement of people, resources, and information, ensuring that survival strategies were implemented. In addition to the practical aspects of faith and survival, there was also a deeply philosophical element. The medieval world was a place where existence was fragile and death was ever present. Belief in the afterlife and in divine protection provided comfort, but it also encouraged a sense of duty and responsibility to one's fellow human beings. The notion of charity, care for the sick, and the protection of the vulnerable became not just religious mandates, but survival strategies. The idea that protecting others was a divine calling spurred people to risk their lives to help those in need, whether by sheltering refugees, hiding dissidents, or providing medical care to the afflicted. In this way, faith was not just a passive comfort. It was a powerful driving force that fueled the survival networks and gave people the strength to resist, endure, and rebuild. As survival networks grew and evolved, they became more tightly woven with religious and spiritual movements. Faith not only sustained the networks during times of crisis, but it also influenced the ways in which these systems adapted to external threats. The next section will explore how these underground systems evolved as political stability returned, transforming into more formalized resistance movements. The legacy of these survival networks, rooted in both faith and necessity, would continue to shape the course of history as the interplay between religion, resistance, and survival strategies left an indelible mark on medieval society. What if the Renaissance, a time of enlightenment, was also a period when secret knowledge from medieval survival networks quietly re-emerged, influencing the very foundations of modern society? The Renaissance, often hailed as a cultural and intellectual rebirth, was not only a period of artistic flourishing and scientific discovery, but also a time when hidden, forgotten knowledge from the medieval world resurfaced. While thinkers, artists, and explorers were rediscovering classical antiquity, they also began to uncover the hidden knowledge of survival tactics, remedies, and strategies that had been passed down through generations in secret. This resurgence was not just an intellectual curiosity, but a powerful force that shaped both the practical and philosophical foundations of the early modern period. The Renaissance marked a shift in how people viewed knowledge, power, and society. Intellectual curiosity surged, and with it came an eagerness to rediscover ancient wisdom that had long been suppressed or lost. This movement was rooted in the belief that knowledge should be freely shared, but it also inadvertently revived some of the most vital survival strategies of the medieval world. These strategies, once hidden in secret libraries, encoded texts, and underground movements, began to resurface as intellectuals and scholars explored not only classical texts, but also the forgotten knowledge that had been kept out of sight during the medieval period. One of the most significant ways in which medieval survival knowledge resurfaced during the Renaissance was through the rediscovery of herbal medicine. In the medieval world, healers had relied on plants, tinctures, and remedies passed down in secret. Much of this knowledge was considered too dangerous by the authorities, who viewed it as a challenge to both religious and medical orthodoxy, and so it was hidden, preserved in private libraries, coded texts, or whispered among trusted circles. With the Renaissance's intellectual thirst for knowledge, herbal medicine began to resurface. Scholars and explorers, inspired by the writings of ancient civilizations like the Egyptians and Greeks, sought out forgotten remedies, some of which were rooted in medieval traditions. These herbal practices were integrated into Renaissance medicine and later shaped modern pharmacology, laying the groundwork for the scientific exploration of medicinal plants and alternative treatments that would continue to evolve over centuries. In addition to medical knowledge, other vital survival tactics also re-emerged during the Renaissance. Agricultural practices, particularly those that had been suppressed or forgotten during the feudal period, were revisited. Medieval farming techniques, such as crop rotation, the use of natural fertilizers, and efficient water management systems, were rediscovered and adapted for the Renaissance context. These methods, once passed down in secret communities, played a crucial role in improving agricultural productivity during a time of population growth and urbanization. Renaissance scholars, particularly in Italy and the Low Countries, were keen to refine and apply these techniques, both to alleviate famine and to support burgeoning urban centres. The recovery of this agricultural knowledge directly impacted the economies of Renaissance Europe, contributing to the growth of commerce and trade. As Renaissance thinkers explored and integrated these survival strategies into their worldview, there was a growing awareness of the political implications of this knowledge. The idea that certain knowledge should be kept hidden, whether to protect it from those in power or to maintain the balance of survival, was not lost on the intellectuals of the time. They were well aware of the power dynamics at play. Just as medieval rulers and the Church had sought to control knowledge, Renaissance scholars began to grapple with the tension between enlightenment and secrecy. Some scholars viewed the rediscovery of knowledge from the medieval world with skepticism, wary of its potential to destabilize the established order. Others embraced it, understanding its value in empowering the common people and resisting oppression. This tension would later fuel the rise of secret societies, which carried forward the traditions of hidden knowledge and resistance into later centuries. The Renaissance, with its emphasis on humanism and individualism, also saw the emergence of secret societies that would preserve and promote the hidden knowledge of the past. While these societies often focused on the pursuit of intellectual enlightenment, many of them carried within them the traditions of the medieval survival networks, secret networks, that had once resisted political and religious authority. These secret societies, like the Freemasons and other fraternal organizations, formed in part as a response to political and social repression. They became sanctuaries for those who sought knowledge outside of the established power structures and a means of passing down ancient and often hidden wisdom. This connection between the Renaissance intellectual revival and the underground networks of the medieval period was more than just an academic curiosity. It was the foundation of a new wave of resistance movements that would later emerge during the Enlightenment and the Revolutionary periods. At the same time, the Renaissance also marked a philosophical shift that would influence the development of modern resistance movements. The Renaissance's focus on individualism, the pursuit of knowledge, and the belief in human potential offered new avenues for challenging the existing political order. This intellectual climate, fueled by rediscovered survival knowledge and a belief in human agency, laid the groundwork for later movements that would seek to challenge monarchies, church authorities, and oppressive systems. As Renaissance thinkers began to question traditional sources of power, they inadvertently paved the way for the kind of social and political upheavals that would erupt during the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. In a broader sense, the Renaissance's embrace of rediscovered knowledge, both intellectual and practical, was a precursor to the modern scientific revolution. The exploration of the natural world, the development of new technologies, and the application of ancient survival tactics all played a role in reshaping the world. The survival knowledge that had once been hidden in monasteries and underground libraries became integrated into the scientific and cultural advancements of the time, from the development of early medicine to the foundation of modern agriculture. As the Renaissance gave rise to a new intellectual and cultural awakening, it also laid the groundwork for the birth of modern resistance movements. The rediscovery of medieval survival knowledge, long buried in secret, became an essential tool for those seeking to challenge the status quo. The intellectual climate of the Renaissance, with its emphasis on knowledge and individualism, ultimately set the stage for the formalized resistance movements that would emerge in the centuries to come. With the Renaissance's resurgence of forgotten survival strategies, the intellectual curiosity of the time would slowly begin to blend with the political struggles that were emerging across Europe. In the next section, we will explore how these survival networks, now infused with new intellectual and political energy, would evolve into more formalized resistance movements, particularly with the rise of the Enlightenment and revolutionary fervor. The ideas and tactics developed during the Renaissance would continue to shape the trajectory of political change in the modern world. What if the revolutionaries who changed the world were secretly using the same survival tactics, developed centuries before methods designed not just to survive, but to overthrow oppressive powers? As the medieval period gave way to the early modern era, political and social tensions began to boil over in Europe. Monarchies grew stronger, empires expanded, and kingdoms consolidated more power. In response to this increasing centralization of authority, dissenting groups like their medieval predecessors began to form in secret. These early revolutionary movements, which sought to challenge or overthrow oppressive political systems, were deeply influenced by the covert survival networks of the past. They adopted many of the same tactics, such as hidden communication methods, underground resource management, and secret safe havens that had once been used by the common people to survive sieges, plagues, and invasions. Much like the survival networks of the medieval world, the revolutionary movements that emerged in the early modern period operated outside the bounds of traditional power structures. As monarchs and church authorities attempted to maintain control over their subjects, those who wished to resist did so in secrecy, knowing that any open opposition could lead to swift retribution. Movements such as the French Revolution, the English Civil War, and later uprisings during the Industrial Revolution borrowed heavily from the strategies perfected by their medieval predecessors. They communicated in code, organized clandestine meetings, and used hidden routes to move resources and people without being detected by the authorities. The French Revolution, perhaps the most famous of these early modern uprisings, was deeply rooted in ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But it was also a direct continuation of the struggle for freedom against political oppression that had existed in earlier centuries. Revolutionary groups like the Jacobins, while ideologically and politically driven, found themselves relying on the same covert methods of resistance that had kept medieval towns alive during times of crisis. They formed underground networks of support, often operating within the shadows of society, away from the eyes of the ruling class. These networks helped to organize protests, plan uprisings, and distribute vital resources like food and arms. In many cases, these revolutionary groups drew inspiration from the tactics of medieval resistance, whether they realized it or not. Like their medieval counterparts, revolutionaries used hidden safe havens to protect leaders, gather supporters, and store resources. During the French Revolution, for example, the network of underground supporters working to overthrow the monarchy relied heavily on secrecy to protect key figures like Robespierre and Danton. These leaders were often hidden in plain sight, travelling through back channels or staying in discreet locations to avoid detection by royalist spies or government forces. In the same way that medieval townsfolk would hide behind the walls of monasteries or churches during a siege, revolutionary leaders would seek refuge in trusted homes, hidden spaces, or secret meeting places to avoid arrest. The use of coded communication was another tactic carried over from medieval survival networks into the revolutionary movements of the early modern period. Just as medieval resistance groups communicated through cryptic symbols, signs, and encrypted texts, so too did the revolutionaries of the 18th century. Messages were passed through secret messengers, often encoded in ways that could only be understood by trusted allies. For example, during the French Revolution, coded letters and symbols were frequently used to communicate vital information about the movement's plans, the locations of meetings, or the distribution of supplies. These messages were often concealed in mundane-looking objects, such as books, clothing, or even in food packages, ensuring they could pass through government checkpoints undetected. The French Revolution was not an isolated example of this underground form of resistance. The English Civil War, which began in the mid-17th century, also relied on covert methods of survival and resistance. The conflict between the royalists and parliamentarians was not just a battle of armies, it was a battle of ideas, ideologies, and access to resources. Both sides relied on underground networks to smuggle weapons, organize revolts, and protect their leaders. The parliamentarians, in particular, used these covert methods to maintain their fight against King Charles I, often hiding in safe houses and communicating through coded letters to avoid detection by royalist spies. In the Industrial Revolution, as working-class uprisings grew in response to oppressive factory conditions, the traditions of secrecy and covert resistance continued to shape revolutionary movements. Labour movements, particularly in England, utilised the same methods of communication and organisation that had been used by underground resistance groups for centuries. Workers communicated through secret meetings, organised through covert pamphleteering, and used coded language to avoid the authorities who sought to suppress their efforts. The underground networks of workers who fought for better wages, working conditions, and rights often faced severe repression. But like their medieval predecessors, they persisted in secrecy, using the strategies of hidden knowledge and covert resistance to fuel their cause. Underlying all of these movements was a shared belief in the power of resistance and the role of hidden networks in shaping political change. Revolutionary leaders, whether in the 18th century or the 19th century, understood the value of maintaining secrecy, protecting critical figures, and ensuring the survival of key ideas. These underground systems allowed revolutions to spread, even when outward signs of resistance were brutally suppressed. They allowed individuals and communities to survive, regroup, and reorganize without the direct interference of the authorities who sought to quash their efforts. These revolutionary movements were not merely political in nature, they were also ideological continuations of the underground survival networks of the medieval period. Both sought to challenge and resist oppressive systems, and both understood that secrecy, survival, and resistance were inextricably linked. The strategies of medieval resistance, such as hidden safe havens, coded communication, and secret supply chains, became the foundation for modern political resistance. The lessons learned in the shadows of medieval society were carried forward into the broader movements of revolution, where they would play a pivotal role in changing the course of history. Having examined the role of medieval survival networks in shaping the early modern revolutions, we now turn to the next chapter, where we will explore how these networks evolved into more formalized resistance movements in the 20th century. With the rise of totalitarian regimes and political oppression, survival networks once again adapted, becoming a crucial part of the fight for freedom in modern history. Could the underground resistance movements of the 20th century be the modern manifestation of the same survival tactics used in medieval times to resist tyranny and oppression? As the world evolved through the tumultuous centuries that followed the medieval period, the spirit of resistance, survival, and defiance against oppressive forces remained steadfast. The legacy of medieval survival networks, honed during times of siege, plague, and political upheaval, didn't disappear, it evolved. In the 20th and 21st centuries, underground resistance movements, particularly those that arose during World War II, mirrored many of the covert strategies employed by medieval towns in their darkest hours. From secret hideouts to covert communication and hidden support systems, these modern resistance groups used similar methods to navigate the perilous times in which they found themselves. One of the most striking examples of this continuity can be seen in the French resistance during World War II. As Nazi forces occupied France, the country's resistance groups became modern-day incarnations of the medieval survival networks. These groups, operating largely in secrecy, used clandestine meetings and hidden safe houses, much like their medieval counterparts. They smuggled vital supplies, aided the escape of prisoners of war, and provided intelligence to Allied forces, all while under the constant threat of detection. The resistance used the same strategies medieval towns had employed to survive sieges, secrecy, covert communication, and the protection of key figures. In many ways, the tactics of these underground networks became as crucial to the success of the war effort as the military strategies of the Allied forces. Similarly, in Eastern Europe, during both the Nazi occupation and later under Soviet rule, resistance movements employed covert methods that mirrored those used in medieval times. Underground groups in countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia used hidden communication routes, safe houses, and coded language to organize and resist oppressive regimes. They operated in the shadows, much like the medieval resistance that had once fought invaders and oppressive rulers. These groups were also instrumental in protecting intellectuals, religious leaders, and political dissidents figures who were crucial to the preservation of culture and thought, just as their medieval predecessors had safeguarded knowledge and leadership during times of crisis. The resilience and survival of these modern resistance movements were deeply influenced by the legacy of medieval survival strategies. The modern resistance fighters were not just focused on direct confrontation, they understood the importance of keeping their networks hidden, protecting their members, and ensuring the survival of their cause. Many resistance groups kept their actions veiled in secrecy, knowing that even the smallest leak of information could lead to the collapse of their efforts. Much like the medieval underground networks, which had to operate in secrecy to avoid detection by invading forces or local authorities, the resistance movements of the 20th century operated in similar covert ways, often relying on trust, secrecy, and a strong sense of moral duty to fuel their efforts. However, the modern era brought with it new challenges, particularly the rise of technology. The advent of the digital age transformed the very nature of covert resistance. While medieval survival networks relied on physical hideouts, hand-delivered messages, and whispered words, modern resistance movements could now utilize encrypted communication, secure online networks, and digital anonymity to protect their operations. Technology, though offering new tools for resistance, also introduced new vulnerabilities. Just as medieval networks had to hide from invading forces, modern resistance movements had to guard against digital surveillance, hacking, and government monitoring. The same principles of secrecy, resource management, and survival applied, but the tools had evolved. In the digital age, activists and whistleblowers who expose corruption, injustice, and state secrets continue the tradition of the hidden resistance networks. Figures like Edward Snowden, who exposed mass surveillance by the US government, or the hackers behind WikiLeaks, who released classified documents exposing government wrongdoing, are part of a long line of resistance movements that have always operated in secrecy. Their work, done in the shadows of modern society, parallels the medieval systems of resistance that kept towns alive under siege or protected dissidents from political persecution. These modern-day whistleblowers use encrypted communications, hidden servers, and anonymous platforms to share information, much like the medieval groups used coded language, secret texts, and trusted messengers to distribute vital knowledge. Modern resistance movements, whether through activism or covert opposition, continue to rely on many of the same survival strategies that medieval groups perfected centuries ago. The importance of protecting resources, hiding key figures, and maintaining secrecy remains just as crucial today as it was during times of medieval crisis. These methods of survival are not just about enduring the immediate threats of oppressive regimes. They are about ensuring the continuity of knowledge, culture, and resistance in the face of overwhelming odds. Just as the medieval underground networks preserved the legacy of survival, modern resistance movements continue to carry that torch forward. In the 21st century, the global nature of political oppression and human rights violations has made the need for these covert networks even more pressing. From authoritarian regimes in North Korea to the fight for freedom in the Middle East, survival networks and resistance movements have adapted once again to new geopolitical realities. These movements, operating in the shadows of society, rely on many of the same principles that medieval survival networks relied on to fight against tyrannical rule. In conclusion, the spirit of resistance and survival that began with medieval underground networks has never truly disappeared. It has simply evolved. From the French resistance in World War II to modern-day whistleblowers and digital activists, the methods and ideals that sustained people through the darkest times in history continue to influence how we resist oppression today. The knowledge and tactics passed down through generations have proven to be timeless, as relevant now as they were in the medieval period. As we move into the final chapter, we will reflect on the lasting impact of these survival networks, examining how they continue to shape contemporary struggles for freedom, justice, and human rights in our increasingly connected world. What if the spirit of resistance and survival that kept medieval towns alive still exists today, hidden in plain sight, in underground movements and encrypted networks fighting for freedom? The principles of medieval survival networks, secrecy, resilience, resourcefulness, and community organization, have endured through centuries, evolving to meet the challenges of the modern world. Though often less visible than their medieval predecessors, these networks continue to play a critical role in shaping modern resistance movements, often operating in ways that are both subtle and powerful. From grassroots political organizations to online activism and encrypted digital networks, the need for covert organization in the face of external threats remains just as pressing today as it was in the medieval period. In the past, survival networks were born from necessity. Towns under siege, oppressed communities, and marginalized groups needed systems of support that could evade detection and protect their way of life. These systems relied on hidden communication methods, secret meeting places, and trusted individuals who carried vital information. Today, while the structure of modern society may have evolved, the need for secrecy, solidarity, and organized resistance continues to drive people to form tight-knit groups dedicated to survival, resistance, and change. Whether combating political oppression, corporate control, or social injustice, the same core principles that kept medieval towns alive under siege are still being applied in contemporary struggles. The modern manifestation of these survival networks often takes on forms that are less tangible than their medieval counterparts, but are equally effective in their function. Grassroots activist groups, for instance, frequently rely on underground methods of communication to organize protests, disseminate information, and coordinate movements without drawing the attention of the authorities. These groups operate on a decentralized model, where leadership is often fluid and decisions are made collectively. This form of organization mirrors the medieval practice of community-driven resistance, where the collective survival of the group took precedence over individual recognition. Modern movements such as Black Lives Matter, environmental activist groups, and political dissidents fighting against authoritarian regimes all draw upon the same organizational structure that medieval survival networks perfected, emphasizing decentralized, flexible leadership and the protection of key individuals. In the digital age, these survival networks have taken on a virtual form. The rise of encrypted communications, secure messaging apps, and online forums has allowed resistance groups to communicate and organize without fear of surveillance or interception. In some countries, where authoritarian governments monitor communications and suppress free speech, the need for digital survival networks has never been greater. Activists, fighting for political freedom, privacy, or social justice, often rely on encrypted networks to protect their messages and evade government scrutiny. Just as medieval communities used secret tunnels or hidden rooms to evade invaders, modern resistance movements use digital encryption and anonymous browsing to shield themselves from surveillance, ensuring their movements remain out of sight until they are ready to strike. In countries with oppressive regimes, such as China or Russia, underground movements have utilized technology to organize protests and expose corruption, much in the same way that their medieval ancestors used secret signs and codes to communicate in times of political strife. Tools like VPNs, virtual private networks, encrypted emails, and secure social media channels are the modern equivalents of the coded letters and hidden messages passed through medieval networks. Digital whistleblowers, similar to the dissidents of medieval times who were forced into hiding, now use encrypted platforms to leak classified government information, protect their identities, and ensure that their work remains shielded from retribution. These tools of resistance are not just used to spread information but to protect the very existence of these movements. One particularly notable development in modern resistance movements is the rise of hacktivism. Groups like Anonymous have leveraged their digital expertise to launch cyber attacks against governments, corporations, and organizations that they see as oppressive. Hacktivists use methods similar to the subversive tactics used by medieval resistance groups, hiding in plain sight, operating in the shadows, and using their expertise to disrupt the status quo. Through cyber attacks, they challenge the power structures that they see as unjust. Much like medieval resistance fighters use sabotage to weaken enemy forces or undermine political authority. Another key feature of modern survival networks is their ability to cross borders and unite people from different parts of the world. While medieval networks were often localized and confined to specific towns or regions, modern movements can unite individuals from around the globe through social media, encrypted communication, and shared goals. Whether fighting for environmental justice, civil rights, or political freedom, these global networks operate on the same principles that kept medieval communities alive. The solidarity found within these movements transcends geographical boundaries, uniting people in their shared fight for survival against systemic oppression. However, despite the immense potential of modern technology, these networks also face new challenges. The same tools that allow activists to evade surveillance also allow governments and corporations to track and monitor their every move. In response, modern resistance groups have become adept at using counter-surveillance techniques, encrypting their data, and employing digital subterfuge to maintain the secrecy of their operations. Just as medieval resistance movements had to operate in secret to avoid the reach of oppressive forces, today's movements are forced to navigate the complexities of digital warfare to protect themselves from being silenced. While these modern movements may not always resemble the visible, physical, underground networks of the past, they are no less important. The principles of survival, resilience, and resistance that were essential to medieval communities still resonate today. Modern survival networks, whether physical or digital, continue to serve as the lifeblood of those fighting against injustice, whether in the streets or online. These movements may look different from those of the past, but their core purpose remains the same: to resist, to survive, and to build a better future. In the next section, we will explore how the principles of survival, resistance, and community organization have been adopted by larger, more visible movements in the fight for social, political, and environmental change. These broader movements, often growing out of the hidden networks of resistance, have become central to shaping the political and social landscape of the modern world, carrying forward the lessons of medieval survival strategies and applying them to contemporary struggles. What if today's social movements are not just new ideas, but the same survival tactics used by medieval networks, adapted to fight for justice in the modern world? The principles that sustained medieval survival networks, secrecy, resilience, and underground collaboration, continue to influence social movements today. From grassroots activist groups to global campaigns for climate change, civil rights, and freedom of speech, the spirit of resistance that once kept medieval communities alive has been transformed into powerful movements that challenge the status quo. These movements, which often begin in secret or as small, covert groups, grow into visible forces that demand justice, equality, and change, all while using the same survival strategies perfected centuries ago. Social movements today rely on the same core principles that medieval underground networks used to navigate oppressive forces: secrecy to protect members and ideas, resilience to endure adversity, and collaboration to strengthen their cause. In many ways, modern movements mirror the medieval resistance movements that organized in response to oppressive powers. Whether they are fighting for civil rights, political freedoms, or environmental justice, these movements adopt strategies of survival that have been passed down through generations, often adapting them to address modern challenges. One of the most prominent examples of these tactics in action is the Arab Spring, a series of pro-democracy uprisings that swept across the Middle East and North Africa beginning in 2010. Despite facing authoritarian governments that controlled communication, free speech, and public discourse, the organizers of the Arab Spring leveraged covert communication tactics similar to those used by medieval resistance groups. Activists used encrypted digital networks, anonymous online forums, and mobile messaging apps to organize protests, share information, and rally support, much like how medieval resistance groups used secret symbols, hidden messages, and trusted messengers to coordinate their movements. The use of digital technology allowed these movements to overcome the limitations of physical space, creating decentralized networks that were harder to infiltrate and suppress. The movement's leaders, many of whom were unknown to the wider public at first, operated in the shadows just as medieval leaders would have done during times of crisis. Through social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook, activists were able to communicate quickly and securely with fellow protesters, organizing demonstrations in secret and often out of sight from government authorities. The Arab Spring demonstrated how covert survival strategies had evolved in the digital age, using encrypted communication and anonymous organizing to bypass authoritarian control and mobilize millions to demand political change. Similarly, the Black Lives Matter (BLM) movement, which started as a hashtag in response to police violence against African Americans, grew into one of the most visible and powerful movements for racial justice in the United States. What began as a series of underground discussions and small, localized protests quickly spread through social media, becoming a global force for change. The tactics used by BLM activists have their roots in the survival networks of the past. In its early days, BLM organizers relied on decentralized, grassroots networks to protect themselves from law enforcement scrutiny. They organized covert meetings, communicated through encrypted channels, and built tight-knit communities that could mobilize quickly and effectively. These same tactics were used to protect key individuals, hide sensitive information, and keep the movement's goals hidden from those who might try to derail or suppress it. Much like medieval resistance movements that built trust through secrecy, BLM relied on building strong, resilient communities committed to justice, even in the face of significant danger. Climate change activism, particularly through groups like Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future, also draws on similar principles of secrecy, resilience, and community collaboration. These modern environmental movements have adapted medieval survival strategies to fight for the planet's future. In cities across the globe, activists have organized underground networks to promote climate justice, often working behind the scenes to plan protests, direct action, and political lobbying. They use encrypted communications and hidden forums to share strategies and organize logistics without being detected by government agencies or corporate entities that may seek to suppress their actions. These movements echo the medieval networks that use secrecy to survive under oppressive regimes. They also adopt the resilience of medieval survivors, refusing to be silenced in the face of adversity, and demonstrating a deep commitment to collective survival and action for the greater good. The shift from covert to visible is one of the most striking features of modern social movements. As these groups grow in size and visibility, they often continue to rely on the same survival strategies. For example, when large-scale protests erupt, organizers still rely on underground methods to protect their actions, even as they become more public. Hidden support networks continue to provide essential resources, whether financial, logistical, or emotional, allowing movements to maintain momentum and push forward with their goals. Additionally, modern movements adapt medieval tactics by drawing on the principles of decentralized organizing. Just as medieval towns relied on local networks of trusted individuals to survive and resist, modern movements are decentralized, allowing for a wide range of activists and leaders to coordinate without the need for a centralized authority. This structure makes it harder for oppressive forces to target the movement as a whole and allows for a more flexible, adaptive form of resistance. Whether it's through community-based organizations, local activism, or virtual organizing, decentralized networks enable social movements to grow and thrive without being easily disrupted by authorities. These modern social movements often find themselves operating in hostile environments, facing everything from government crackdowns to media suppression. The strategies that allowed medieval survival networks to persist in the face of invasions and sieges, secrecy, resilience, and community, continue to provide the foundation for modern resistance. Just as medieval groups resisted external control and kept vital knowledge alive through underground networks, today's movements resist political oppression and fight for justice using similar methods, whether through encrypted communications or decentralized leadership. The influence of medieval survival networks on modern social movements shows just how enduring these tactics are. Despite the technological and societal changes that have occurred over the centuries, the core principles of survival and resistance have remained remarkably consistent. From encrypted networks in the digital realm to grassroots protests in the streets, the survival strategies that helped communities resist tyranny and oppression in medieval times have evolved and continue to shape the social and political landscape of the modern world. In the next section, we will explore how these survival tactics and resistance strategies are not only political but deeply philosophical. We will reflect on the deeper meanings of survival, secrecy, and resilience in contemporary society, and how these principles resonate with current global struggles for justice, freedom, and human rights. This will lead us into a discussion on the philosophical and ethical debates surrounding resistance movements today. Can resistance ever be truly ethical when the very act of survival requires secrecy and subversion? And how do modern movements navigate this moral dilemma? The survival strategies developed by medieval underground networks, secrecy, subversion, and resistance, raised profound ethical questions that resonate today. Whether in response to political oppression, social injustice, or environmental destruction, survival often requires difficult, morally complex decisions. In medieval times, resistance movements faced moral dilemmas when deciding whether to prioritize the survival of their communities at the expense of ethical or legal boundaries. Today, modern movements wrestle with similar questions. What does it mean to resist when resistance itself may involve deception, secrecy, or even civil disobedience? The tension between survival and morality is at the heart of resistance movements, both past and present. In medieval times, survival networks often had to make ethical compromises to protect their communities from external threats. Whether smuggling food, hiding dissidents, or sabotaging enemy forces, these actions were not without moral consequences. At what point did self-preservation become morally justifiable? Was it acceptable to break laws, deceive authorities, or even endanger others for the sake of survival? These same ethical questions continue to haunt modern movements, where activists, whistleblowers, and resistance groups face similar dilemmas in their fight against oppression and injustice. The decision to go underground, to operate in secrecy, is one of the most ethically charged aspects of resistance. Throughout history, resistance groups have often relied on secrecy to protect their members and their plans. In medieval times, this meant hiding vital knowledge in secret texts, using coded messages, and organizing meetings in concealed locations. Modern-day activists, from those involved in civil rights movements to climate change advocacy, have similarly used secrecy to avoid detection by oppressive forces. But is secrecy always justified? Does it undermine the integrity of a cause if the methods of resistance are hidden or subversive? Take, for example, the ethical implications of whistleblowing. In the modern world, activists and whistleblowers often operate in secrecy, leaking information about corruption, government surveillance, or corporate malfeasance. While these acts of defiance are intended to expose injustice, they also raise complex ethical questions. Is it morally acceptable to break the law if the law is unjust? In the case of whistleblowers like Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning, The act of survival, keeping their actions secret to protect themselves, was essential to their ability to expose hidden truths. But the decision to go public with classified information and the potential risks to national security further complicates the ethical considerations. Were their actions morally justified, even if they led to unintended consequences? The ethical considerations in medieval resistance movements were often less about abstract moral theory and more about practical survival. In times of invasion, plagues, or oppressive rule, the decision to preserve life and resist external threats was often driven by necessity rather than philosophical reflection. Yet, these decisions were not always clear-cut. Resistance movements sometimes had to weigh the cost of survival against the harm their actions might cause to others. For example, acts of sabotage or violence intended to resist invaders could have devastating effects on innocent civilians. In the medieval context, these moral dilemmas were often framed as sacrifices for the greater good, but they were no less ethically challenging. In modern resistance movements, particularly in the digital age, these dilemmas continue to unfold. Surveillance, for example, has become a major concern for activists in today's world. Governments and corporations have unprecedented access to personal data and digital communications, raising important questions about privacy and security. How far can resistance groups go in protecting their activities from surveillance? How do modern activists, using encrypted communications, hidden servers, and anonymous platforms, navigate the ethics of secrecy? Just as medieval communities used hidden chambers to protect survivors from invaders, today's digital networks act as sanctuaries for those seeking to resist oppression without exposing themselves to harm. This brings us to the broader question of the ethics of civil disobedience. The concept of civil disobedience, pioneered by thinkers like Henry David Thoreau and later embraced by leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., is built on the idea that breaking the law can be a morally justified response to unjust systems. For activists today, the line between ethical and unethical resistance is often blurry. If the goal of resistance is to expose corruption, challenge injustice, or protect the marginalized, is it acceptable to use subversive tactics, even when those actions break laws or challenge authority? This tension between ethical principles and survival strategies is one of the core challenges facing modern resistance movements. Furthermore, the ethics of resistance are not only about the methods used, but also about the larger goal of the movement. What is the ultimate aim of resistance? Is it simply to survive? Or is it to create a more just and equitable society? In the case of modern social justice movements, such as Black Lives Matter or the global climate strikes, the fight for survival is not just about evading oppressive forces, it is about confronting and dismantling systems of power that perpetuate inequality, violence, and environmental destruction. In these contexts, the moral question becomes, how do we resist systems of oppression in a way that is both ethical and effective? Can resistance be both moral and successful, or do the methods of survival inevitably compromise the end goal? The principles of resistance, survival, and community organization that were forged in medieval times have laid the foundation for many of the social movements of today. These movements continue to grapple with the same ethical dilemmas faced by their medieval predecessors. When is it justifiable to break the rules, and how can we ensure that the means of resistance do not undermine the moral integrity of the cause? The spirit of resistance that helped communities survive in the past is alive today, but it has evolved. In the modern world, the tools of resistance, whether digital encryption or grassroots organizing, allow activists to continue the fight against injustice. Yet, the ethical considerations that accompany these actions remain deeply complex, as they must navigate the tension between survival and morality. As we conclude this section, we will reflect on how the legacy of medieval survival strategies continues to influence contemporary philosophical and ethical debates. The deeper meanings of survival, resistance, and secrecy are more relevant today than ever. As we confront new challenges in our increasingly interconnected world, these timeless principles continue to shape our response to injustice, both in visible movements and in the hidden networks that work tirelessly to make change. This philosophical reflection will lead into the next section, where we'll explore how the enduring legacy of these networks continues to shape contemporary thought and action. What if the very movements fighting for freedom and justice today are using the same survival strategies developed centuries ago, still operating in the shadows, yet more powerful than ever? The medieval survival networks, born out of necessity during times of siege, plague, and oppression, have had a profound, often unnoticed impact on the modern world. While these networks initially existed to ensure the survival of individuals and communities in the face of external threats, their influence extends far beyond physical survival. Today, the principles they established, secrecy, resilience, solidarity, and community-based action, continue to shape the way modern resistance movements organize, protect vulnerable communities, and resist oppressive systems. In the past, these survival networks operated in the shadows, working quietly to ensure that vital resources were preserved, information was shared securely, and individuals were protected from harm. They were born from the need to survive under the harshest conditions, but their legacy has evolved into the powerful forces we see in today's human rights movements, environmental activism, and political resistance efforts. The same core principles that governed medieval survival networks continue to inform how we approach social justice, equality, and freedom in the modern world. One of the clearest legacies of medieval survival networks is their influence on grassroots community organizing. Just as medieval towns relied on tightly knit, local networks of trusted individuals to share resources, organize resistance, and protect their people, modern grassroots movements often start small, with local communities coming together to address shared concerns. In contemporary activism, this sense of solidarity is a vital force. Whether it's local groups organizing to combat police violence, address housing crises, or advocate for environmental justice, these movements rely on the same principles that medieval resistance movements used: collective action, mutual aid, and the power of the community to resist external control. Modern activists understand that the survival of their movements depends on trust within their communities, just as medieval groups had to trust one another in their fight for survival. Take, for example, the rise of community-based environmental movements that have flourished in recent years. Groups fighting climate change, such as Fridays for Future or Extinction Rebellion, use the same decentralized structure that medieval survival networks relied on. They are organized in a way that allows for local autonomy while maintaining a unified goal. Just as medieval resistance groups created underground safe houses, these movements create spaces for safe action, places where vulnerable communities can organize without fear of immediate retaliation from powerful forces. The solidarity between activists and the resilience that drives them forward echo the community-based action of the past. Another modern manifestation of the legacy of medieval survival networks can be found in anonymous online activism. Digital platforms and social media have become the modern equivalents of the secret passageways and hidden chambers once used by resistance fighters. Hacktivism, the use of digital networks to resist political oppression, corporate corruption, or government surveillance, has its roots in the covert systems that medieval networks relied upon. Modern groups like Anonymous or WikiLeaks embody the same spirit of resistance that medieval underground networks had, protecting their members through secrecy, communicating in coded language, and distributing sensitive information to challenge power structures. These digital resistance movements leverage technology to create virtual spaces of survival and activism that cannot be easily controlled by authoritarian regimes or corporate interests. Moreover, the role of modern-day whistleblowers in exposing corruption and injustice mirrors the actions of medieval figures who risked their lives to protect communities or preserve knowledge in the face of oppressive forces. Just as medieval resistance networks were essential for sharing information about military movements, oppressive rulers, or hidden resources, modern whistleblowers use their positions of access to reveal the hidden truths of governments, corporations, and institutions that otherwise operate behind closed doors. Whether it's through leaking classified documents or exposing corporate malfeasance, whistleblowers continue to be the modern-day counterparts to the trusted figures in medieval networks who ensured the survival of vital knowledge. By operating in secret, they shield themselves from retaliation while shining a light on abuses of power, and their actions often spark societal change, much like the subversive acts carried out by medieval groups. The ongoing relevance of medieval survival strategies can also be seen in the way resistance movements, whether digital or physical, often begin in secret and grow into visible forces. The early days of the Arab Spring, for instance, were marked by covert organizing activists using encrypted messages and hidden networks to coordinate protests. It wasn't until the movement gained enough momentum that it became a visible force on the streets of Tunisia, Egypt, and across the Middle East. The early days of these movements were deeply informed by medieval resistance tactics, where secrecy was necessary to survive under oppressive regimes. What started as a small, covert group of activists grew into a massive, visible revolution that ultimately had a global impact. In modern political resistance movements too, the strategies that once operated in hidden spaces are now visible, but still carry with them the ethos of survival. Movements like Black Lives Matter or the fight for LGBTQ+ rights began as smaller, localized efforts that operated underground, utilizing secret meetings, encrypted communications, and coded messages to evade authorities. Over time, these movements grew into global forces, advocating for justice and equality on a much larger stage. Still, they retained the principles of secrecy, resilience, and solidarity that made medieval survival networks so effective. Their strategies, while visible and vocal in the public sphere, still retain the subtlety and adaptability of the medieval networks they were inspired by. Ultimately, the hidden impact of medieval survival networks on modern society lies in their ability to adapt and persist in the face of adversity. These networks may have started in the shadows, but their influence now extends into the very core of modern resistance movements. By using tactics rooted in secrecy, resilience, and community action, these movements continue to shape society's response to injustice, inequality, and oppression. As we turn to the next section, we will explore how these survival strategies have evolved with the advent of digital technology, allowing modern resistance networks to scale their efforts globally while remaining hidden from authoritarian scrutiny. The digital age has transformed the landscape of resistance, offering new opportunities for activism while maintaining the essential principles of secrecy and subversion. This digital evolution will provide the foundation for understanding how the quiet power of survival networks continues to influence movements around the world today. What if the secret survival networks of today aren't in hidden bunkers or underground tunnels, but in the encrypted corners of the internet where the fight for freedom continues, out of sight from oppressive eyes? The rise of digital technology has dramatically transformed the nature of resistance movements, allowing survival networks that once relied on physical spaces to evolve into powerful virtual forces. In the digital age, survival networks are no longer confined to secret rooms or hidden passageways. They now exist in the vast and ever-expanding realm of cyberspace, where they can organize, communicate, and resist without being physically detected. These digital survival networks, built on the same principles of secrecy, resilience, and decentralized structure that powered medieval resistance, are now fighting for justice in new and innovative ways. The internet, encrypted messaging, and online forums have opened up unprecedented opportunities for activists and resistance groups to operate in ways that were previously unimaginable. What medieval survival networks accomplished through hidden meetings and covert communication is now being realized through encrypted digital communication, secure messaging apps, and virtual meeting spaces. While medieval resistance groups used clandestine symbols, secret passages, and coded language, modern digital networks rely on encryption, anonymity, and decentralized structures to protect their members and subvert oppressive powers. This transformation represents a new chapter in the history of resistance, a shift from physical secrecy to digital subversion. One of the most well-known examples of digital survival networks in the modern world is the hacktivist group Anonymous. Operating in the shadows of the internet, Anonymous has engaged in cyber attacks, data leaks, and activism, often in opposition to governments, corporations, and institutions perceived to be abusing power. Just like medieval resistance groups, Anonymous uses encryption and anonymity to protect the identities of its members while carrying out actions designed to disrupt oppressive forces. Their efforts, which range from protesting government surveillance to exposing corporate corruption, represent a digital evolution of the covert tactics once used by those who resisted feudal lords, invading armies, or oppressive regimes. Hacktivists today employ the same strategies that kept medieval survival networks alive: hidden communications, decentralized organizing, and stealthy action to undermine those in power. In authoritarian regimes, where freedom of speech is often brutally suppressed, digital survival networks are an essential tool for resistance. Activists in countries like China, Russia, and Iran have relied on encrypted communication and virtual networks to organize protests, circulate information, and coordinate resistance without being detected by oppressive authorities. These modern movements mirror the medieval networks that kept communities hidden and protected from external threats. Through the use of encrypted messaging apps like Signal, VPNs, virtual private networks, and decentralized platforms like Tor, modern activists can shield their communications from government surveillance, much like their medieval counterparts used secret channels to pass information without being detected. This digital transformation of survival networks has allowed movements to scale their efforts globally. One of the most powerful examples of this global reach is the Arab Spring, a series of uprisings that spread across the Middle East and North Africa in 2010 and 2011. Initially, organizers communicated through encrypted online channels, using social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter to rally support and spread messages of resistance. Despite the authoritarian nature of many of the regimes they sought to overthrow, activists were able to coordinate their efforts from behind the digital veil, organizing mass protests and mobilizing thousands of people with unprecedented speed. The virtual nature of these movements allowed them to circumvent traditional forms of state control, including censorship, surveillance, and physical repression. However, the rise of digital technology has created new vulnerabilities for these networks. While the internet allows for greater connectivity and the ability to organize globally, it has also made it easier for governments, corporations, and other powerful entities to monitor and track digital activity. The very tools that allow resistance groups to remain hidden from their oppressors, encryption, secure communication, and anonymity, are also tools that can be weaponized by those in power. Governments and corporations are investing heavily in technologies designed to infiltrate and disrupt these networks. In response, modern resistance groups are forced to develop increasingly sophisticated tactics to evade detection and maintain their effectiveness. Digital surveillance, the hacking of encrypted systems, and the use of artificial intelligence to track online behavior have become major threats to these digital survival networks. The challenge of maintaining security in a hyper-connected world has pushed digital survival networks to adapt and evolve in ways that medieval networks could never have imagined. To remain hidden, many digital activists now employ multi-layered strategies, combining encrypted messaging with the use of VPNs, Tor browser, designed to anonymize online activity, and decentralized technologies such as blockchain. These tools not only help keep their communications secure, but also enable activists to organize and share information in ways that are harder to censor or disrupt. Just as medieval resistance networks used their knowledge of terrain and secret passageways to evade enemy forces, today's digital activists use sophisticated encryption and technological subterfuge to hide their activities from government and corporate surveillance. One of the most intriguing aspects of modern digital survival networks is their ability to operate on a global scale. The internet has created a borderless space for activism, allowing individuals and groups to connect, organize, and resist across geographical divides. For example, the rise of online platforms like Reddit, Twitter, and Instagram has facilitated the growth of global movements that address issues ranging from climate change to police brutality. These digital platforms provide virtual meeting spaces where activists can exchange ideas, coordinate actions, and mobilize support, all while maintaining a level of anonymity and security. What began as small, localized groups similar to medieval underground resistance has now expanded into massive, global movements that span continents and reach millions of people. Digital whistleblowers, who expose government or corporate wrongdoing, also reflect the legacy of medieval survival networks. Much like the individuals who hid forbidden knowledge during times of persecution, modern whistleblowers use digital channels to leak sensitive information and draw attention to systemic corruption. These individuals often operate in secrecy, using encrypted messaging, anonymous browsing, and secure platforms to protect their identities while exposing the hidden abuses of power. From Edward Snowden's revelations about government surveillance to the WikiLeaks disclosures, digital whistleblowers continue to challenge powerful systems, making visible the information that those in power would prefer to keep hidden. As digital survival networks continue to grow and evolve, they face ongoing challenges. While technology has provided new avenues for organizing and resisting oppression, it has also created new battlegrounds. The same digital tools that activists use to resist tyranny are now being weaponized against them by those who wish to suppress dissent. The question remains, how can digital survival networks continue to thrive in a world where both the technology and the surveillance tools have become so advanced? In the next section, we will explore the ethical implications of these digital survival networks, looking at the moral questions surrounding secrecy, resistance, and activism in the digital age. How do activists balance the need for privacy and security with the desire for transparency and accountability. This examination will delve into the complex ethical dilemmas faced by those fighting for justice and freedom in an increasingly connected yet surveilled world. What if the line between right and wrong blurs when survival and resistance depend on secrecy and subversion? How do modern-day rebels navigate the ethical grey areas of their fight for freedom? Modern resistance movements, particularly those operating in the digital realm, are grappling with some of the most complex ethical dilemmas of our time. The survival networks that once existed in the shadows, driven by the need to resist oppression, continue to thrive. But now, they face a moral crossroads. While secrecy and subversion were essential to the success of medieval survival networks, today's activists must balance these tactics with the demands for transparency, accountability, and justice. The tension between the need for secrecy and the call for open, ethical resistance has never been more pronounced. Historically, survival networks thrived on secrecy, hiding individuals, movements, and messages to evade detection by oppressive forces. In medieval times, resistance fighters had no choice but to operate covertly to ensure the safety of their communities. In the modern world, digital survival networks, such as hacktivist groups, whistleblowers, and resistance movements operating in authoritarian regimes, continue to rely on these age-old principles of secrecy. Whether it's encrypting communications, using anonymous platforms, or engaging in covert online activism, secrecy remains a core strategy for resisting oppression. However, in today's world, secrecy sometimes conflicts with the demand for transparency, leading to ethical dilemmas that force modern activists to question the morality of their actions. One of the central ethical questions faced by modern survival networks is the justification of breaking the law in the name of resistance. Today, acts of resistance often involve hacking, leaking confidential documents, or exposing corruption, all of which are, in many cases, illegal. Whistleblowers like Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning, for example, have revealed vast government surveillance programs, despite knowing that their actions would violate national security laws. Similarly, hacktivist groups like Anonymous have engaged in cyber attacks against governments and corporations that they deem unjust. While these acts are aimed at exposing abuses of power and fighting for justice, they raise a critical question. Should activists break the law for the greater good? This ethical dilemma is not a new one. It mirrors the moral quandaries faced by medieval survival networks, which often had to decide whether to break laws or defy authority to protect their communities. In the face of oppressive systems, medieval resistance groups used tactics like smuggling, sabotage, and hiding key individuals, all of which were considered crimes under the law. In both cases, historical and modern activists are forced to make difficult choices. Is it justifiable to engage in illegal or subversive activities to resist an unjust system, or does this action compromise the moral integrity of the resistance? The philosophical underpinnings of these modern movements often reflect the idea that survival and resistance can justify moral compromises. Activists and resistance leaders justify their actions by framing their fight as a higher moral cause, fighting for freedom, justice, and equality in the face of corrupt or oppressive systems. Hacktivists, for instance, argue that exposing corruption, corporate malfeasance, or government surveillance is more important than adhering to the law, especially when the law itself is being used to perpetrate injustice. For these modern rebels, the act of survival and resistance often means subverting or even breaking the laws of the land to expose deeper truths. This justification for law-breaking is supported by ethical theories such as utilitarianism, which argues that the moral worth of an action is determined by its outcome. If the result of a subversive act such as leaking classified information or disrupting a government website is to bring about a greater good, such as transparency or the protection of human rights, then the action may be morally justifiable. Modern-day resistance movements, much like their medieval counterparts, often see themselves as working toward a greater societal good, even if it means operating outside the law. These groups are driven by a belief that the ends freedom, justice, and accountability justify the means. However, this reasoning doesn't come without its complications. The ethical consequences of these actions can be far-reaching and complex. For example, when a hacktivist group compromises a government database, or when a whistleblower leaks sensitive documents, there are potential risks, unintended consequences that can affect innocent people, national security, or diplomatic relations. Just as medieval resistance movements sometimes faced the moral dilemma of whether their actions harmed innocent bystanders, modern resistance groups must weigh the potential fallout of their actions. What happens when the exposure of hidden truths causes widespread chaos or harms individuals who were not involved in the original conflict? Can a resistance movement justify its actions if the consequences go beyond its intended targets? Furthermore, the increasing sophistication of surveillance and digital technologies has added a new layer of complexity to these ethical questions. In an era of mass surveillance, where governments and corporations have access to vast amounts of data about individuals' private lives, the ethical implications of secrecy and resistance become even more pronounced. How do activists maintain their commitment to transparency and justice while also protecting their own privacy and safety? The paradox of the digital age is that the same technology that has enabled resistance movements to thrive also makes it easier for oppressive regimes to track, monitor, and suppress these movements. The need for secrecy and anonymity in this context is not just a strategy for survival, it is a moral necessity to protect both the activists and the integrity of their cause. As we reflect on the ethical dilemmas faced by modern-day activists, we must also consider how these issues are interconnected with the broader legacy of medieval survival networks. Both then and now, resistance has always required hard choices between survival and compromise, secrecy and transparency, lawfulness and justice. The medieval resistance groups that fought for their survival made calculated decisions to protect their communities, even when those decisions were ethically ambiguous. Today, digital resistance movements face similar challenges, using the tools available to them, whether encrypted communications, hacking, or leaking, to expose hidden truths and fight for justice. But as technology continues to evolve, so too does the moral terrain in which these movements operate. This section sets the stage for a deeper exploration of the broader implications of these survival networks. As we conclude this chapter, we will reflect on the lasting legacy of medieval survival tactics and how they continue to shape the future of resistance movements. These ethical dilemmas and moral decisions remain central to the fight for justice and freedom, challenging activists to navigate the complexities of secrecy, subversion, and survival in a world where the line between right and wrong is often blurred. What if the stories of hidden societies and secret resistance movements that have captivated generations are not just fictional, but echoes of real survival networks that shaped history? The legacy of medieval survival networks has not only endured in the realms of politics and ethics, but has also resonated deeply in art, literature, and media. These hidden systems, operating in the shadows to protect communities and resist oppressive forces, have become powerful symbols of resistance and resilience in popular culture. Over the centuries, the mythos of secret societies, underground movements, and covert resistance has been reimagined, explored, and immortalized in countless stories from historical fiction to modern-day thrillers, capturing the collective imagination of societies across time. Medieval survival networks, often depicted as clandestine societies, resistance factions, or hidden cells of rebellion, provided rich inspiration for storytellers seeking to explore the human desire for freedom, justice, and survival in the face of tyranny. These hidden systems, whether in the form of secret passageways, encrypted messages, or subversive actions, have continued to echo throughout cultural narratives. One of the most compelling aspects of these survival networks is their universal appeal, transcending time and place. Whether it's the secrecy of the underground resistance during World War II, or the resistance of marginalized communities under oppressive regimes, the basic human struggle for survival against overwhelming odds resonates deeply across cultures and eras. Perhaps one of the most iconic examples of the cultural resonance of survival networks is the portrayal of Anne Frank's hiding in The Diary of Anne Frank. Frank's account of life in hiding during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands reflects the very essence of medieval survival networks: the need for secrecy, the reliance on trusted allies, and the constant threat of exposure and danger. The Frank family's underground existence, aided by a network of friends who risked their lives to provide food, shelter, and safety, mirrors the types of resistance efforts that medieval underground networks engaged in to survive invaders and oppressive rulers. Anne Frank's diary is not just a personal account of life in hiding. It is a testament to the enduring human spirit of survival and resistance, themes deeply embedded in the fabric of these historical survival networks. The appeal of secret survival networks is also evident in George Orwell's 1984, a novel set in a dystopian future where the ruling party maintains totalitarian control over every aspect of life. In this world, Winston Smith, the protagonist, secretly resists the omnipresent surveillance of Big Brother through his thoughts, actions, and underground rebellion. While the book centers around government surveillance, oppression, and the suppression of individuality, it also highlights the essential role of secret resistance movements. Just as medieval survival networks relied on secrecy and covert actions to fight back against tyrannical forces, Orwell's dystopian world imagines a modern society where survival depends on clandestine networks, hidden away from the ever-watchful eyes of the state. Winston's rebellion is symbolic of the ongoing struggle for freedom in societies that seek to control and suppress the individual. In The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, we see yet another representation of survival networks, this time set in a post-apocalyptic world where the oppressed districts must secretly band together to challenge the totalitarian capital. The protagonist, Katniss Everdeen, becomes the figurehead of the rebellion, a movement born from underground cells and resistance networks that fight to overthrow a brutal regime. Much like the medieval survival networks that were created out of necessity, Katniss and her fellow rebels rely on secrecy, trust, and resilience to survive. The clandestine nature of the rebellion and its reliance on covert action mirrors the historical underground movements that fought for survival and freedom in oppressive times. The Mockingjay, symbolizing resistance, becomes the rallying cry for the oppressed, just as symbols of rebellion, like flags or signs, were used to unite resistance movements in medieval and modern history. Beyond literature and film, the influence of survival networks also extends to other forms of media, including television and video games, in shows like The Man in the High Castle, based on Philip K. Dick's novel, we see a reimagining of the post-World War II world, where the Axis powers have won and resistance movements operate in secret. The show portrays the moral complexities of resistance, echoing the dilemmas faced by those involved in medieval survival networks. When does survival cross the line into active rebellion, and what are the personal and collective costs of fighting back? The series highlights the power of underground networks that fight against oppressive regimes, a theme deeply rooted in the historical context of survival movements. Video games such as Assassin's Creed and Deus Ex further expand on the concept of secret societies and resistance movements. In Assassin's Creed, players step into the shoes of a member of an ancient order of assassins, whose purpose is to fight against oppressive forces, often operating in secret to subvert governments and institutions. Similarly, in Deus Ex, players navigate a dystopian future where a powerful elite controls society through surveillance and manipulation. Both games draw heavily on the historical and cultural legacy of survival networks, using themes of secrecy, resistance, and survival as central narrative elements. The enduring popularity of these cultural depictions is a testament to the timeless appeal of the struggle for freedom and justice. The themes of survival networks, often portrayed as underground movements fighting back against overwhelming oppression, resonate with audiences because they tap into a fundamental human experience, the desire for autonomy, freedom, and justice. These stories, whether set in the past, present, or future, reflect the ongoing struggle of individuals and communities to resist forces that seek to control or suppress them. The cultural impact of survival networks extends beyond mere entertainment. It serves as a mirror for the ongoing struggles of marginalized communities today. From the fight for racial justice to the battle for environmental protection, the same themes of resilience, secrecy, and resistance found in art, literature, and media continue to inspire real-world movements. The stories of hidden societies and covert rebellion are not just fictional accounts. They are reflections of the very real networks that have existed throughout history. Networks that have shaped our understanding of freedom, resistance, and survival. As we look toward the political implications of these cultural representations in the next section, we will explore how survival networks have subtly influenced political resistance movements, shaping the modern fight for justice and social change. The myths and metaphors of resistance that have been perpetuated in popular culture continue to inspire and inform the strategies of those fighting for a more just and equitable world today. What if the underground resistance movements of today, those fighting authoritarianism and oppression, are not so different from the medieval survival networks that helped people survive tyranny in the past? The political impact of survival networks, which began as systems of covert action and mutual support in the face of external threats, has played a pivotal role in shaping resistance movements throughout history. From the French Revolution to the Cold War, resistance movements in Eastern Europe, these underground networks have evolved into powerful political forces, providing the tools and strategies necessary to resist oppression and fight for freedom. The legacy of medieval survival tactics, secrecy, trust, and decentralized organizing continues to empower political movements around the world, particularly in regions where authoritarian regimes suppress political dissent. The first major historical example of survival networks influencing political resistance comes from the French Revolution. In the late 18th century, as the French monarchy crumbled and the revolutionary fervor spread, a network of secret societies, political conspirators, and underground activists mobilized to challenge the old regime. Much like the medieval resistance networks that used covert communication and hidden safe houses to survive sieges, the revolutionaries in France relied on secrecy and clandestine operations to avoid the watchful eyes of the monarchy's authorities. The Jacobins, a political faction during the Revolution, used underground networks to organize resistance, distribute pamphlets, and coordinate protests. These revolutionary tactics, rooted in the same survival strategies of secrecy and mutual support that medieval networks used, were essential in overcoming the power of the monarchy and shifting the political landscape of France. Similarly, in the 20th century, survival networks played a key role in political resistance movements during the Cold War, particularly in Eastern Europe, where communist regimes suppressed political freedom and human rights. In countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, underground networks formed to resist Soviet control and fight for democratic reforms. These networks, which often operated in the shadows, used the same strategies as medieval survival movements. They communicated through secret channels, protected key figures, and coordinated acts of defiance. One of the most notable examples is the Polish resistance group Solidarity, which began as an underground labor movement and eventually became a powerful political force that helped bring down communism in Poland. The success of Solidarity was made possible by the same principles of resilience, secrecy, and community organizing that had defined earlier resistance movements throughout history. The effectiveness of these political resistance movements was rooted in the adaptability of medieval survival tactics. Whether left-wing or right-wing, these movements used the same tools to undermine oppressive regimes, hidden networks, covert operations, and trusted communities. The basic structure of these movements was not unlike the systems medieval resistance fighters used to preserve life and fight for survival. Decentralized, secretive, and built on the trust of a few individuals dedicated to a larger cause. In Eastern Europe, as in the medieval era, resistance groups often had to operate under great danger, but they were empowered by their ability to remain hidden, communicate in code, and act with stealth. The legacy of these medieval survival tactics is evident in modern resistance movements that continue to fight for freedom in politically volatile regions around the world. In places like Venezuela, Myanmar, and Hong Kong, where authoritarian governments use surveillance, censorship, and violence to suppress dissent, modern resistance groups have adapted these ancient strategies to continue their fight for democracy. In Venezuela, for example, opposition movements have relied on clandestine networks to organize protests, distribute information, and resist the oppressive tactics of the Maduro regime. These networks are often hidden from government surveillance, using encrypted digital tools, secret meeting places, and underground channels to coordinate action. Just as medieval resistance groups once hid their leaders and plans to avoid detection, these modern movements use similar tactics to avoid the reach of authoritarian governments that seek to crush their resistance. In Myanmar, during the military coup of 2021, the civilian resistance movement, known as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, relied heavily on decentralized networks to organize strikes, protests, and acts of defiance. The CDM quickly adapted to digital organizing, using encrypted messaging platforms and social media to communicate covertly and mobilize supporters. Like the medieval survival networks, the CDM's success depended on secrecy, mutual trust, and the ability to work outside the official structures of power. The movement demonstrated that even in the face of extreme violence and repression, the power of decentralized, secretive networks could still mobilize the masses to resist and fight for a just cause. These modern examples show how the legacy of medieval survival networks continues to shape contemporary resistance efforts. The same principles that allowed oppressed communities to survive and resist in medieval times, secrecy, decentralized leadership, and community-based support continue to inform the tactics used by political resistance movements today. While the tools and technology have changed, the core principles of these movements remain remarkably similar to those used by medieval resistance groups. However, the evolution of these networks also brings new challenges. In the digital age, while the internet offers new avenues for organizing and mobilizing resistance, it also presents new vulnerabilities. Governments and corporations can track, monitor, and disrupt online networks, and resistance movements must constantly adapt to avoid detection. The very tools that allow modern activists to organize encrypted communication, anonymous browsing, and digital encryption are the same tools that governments use to monitor and suppress dissent. As a result, modern resistance movements must constantly evolve, developing new ways to remain hidden and effective while continuing to fight for political freedom. Despite these challenges, the endurance of medieval survival strategies in modern political movements highlights their lasting relevance. The covert tactics that allowed medieval communities to resist invaders, oppressive rulers, and external threats are the same tactics that continue to empower communities today. Whether it's the encrypted networks of today's digital resistance or the grassroots movements challenging authoritarian regimes, the spirit of survival and resistance that shaped medieval history continues to fuel modern political change. After examining the political implications of these survival networks, we'll turn to the broader ethical dilemmas surrounding these movements. How do activists today navigate the complexities of resistance in a world where the lines between right and wrong are often blurred? We will explore the moral challenges faced by resistance groups and the ongoing philosophical questions surrounding survival, rebellion, and the pursuit of justice in the modern world. Is it ethical to break the law in the name of survival? How do resistance movements balance the pursuit of justice with the moral complexities of their actions? Throughout history, the survival networks that have supported resistance movements have often required difficult moral decisions. As communities have fought for their rights and freedom, survival has sometimes meant operating outside the law, using subversive tactics, and risking personal safety. These actions, though essential for challenging oppressive forces, often come with profound ethical consequences. The tension between secrecy, violence, and the pursuit of justice creates moral dilemmas that resist simple answers. Today, as modern activists, digital warriors, and political dissidents continue these struggles, they grapple with these same questions, which are deeply rooted in the long history of resistance. Survival networks, both medieval and modern, have often had to weigh their choices carefully. At the heart of these networks lies the concept of survival, not just of individuals, but of entire communities or movements fighting against overwhelming power. In the face of repression, the question arises: is it justified to break the law, use subversive tactics, or even resort to violence in the name of survival and justice? These moral questions are not unique to any one time period. Whether it was medieval peasants fighting against feudal lords or modern-day activists protesting state violence, resistance movements have consistently faced the dilemma of whether the means can justify the ends. One of the most significant ethical questions posed by resistance movements is whether it is ever morally acceptable to break the law. Resistance groups, whether medieval or contemporary, often find themselves operating outside the established legal framework, which is typically aligned with the interests of the ruling powers. From the medieval underground movements that helped communities survive invasions, to modern digital activists and whistleblowers exposing government secrets, the act of breaking laws is often framed as a moral imperative in the pursuit of justice. The concept of civil disobedience, famously advanced by thinkers like Henry David Thoreau and later by Martin Luther King Jr., plays a central role in understanding the ethics of resistance. Civil disobedience posits that when laws are unjust, it is not only morally permissible, but sometimes a moral duty to resist. Thoreau's refusal to pay taxes in protest of slavery and the Mexican-American War is a prime example, as is King's nonviolent resistance during the civil rights movement. This philosophy suggests that while laws are generally meant to be followed, oppressive or immoral laws must be challenged, and breaking them can be a moral act when it aims to create a more just society. But this idea is complicated in practice. When resistance involves breaking the law, the consequences can be severe, ranging from imprisonment to loss of life. The modern-day whistleblower, for example, faces immense personal risk when exposing systemic corruption, yet many see their actions as a necessary moral stand against greater injustice. In the digital age, the ethical challenges of resistance are compounded. The rise of hacktivism, where activists use hacking techniques to expose corruption or disrupt oppressive systems, raises the question, is it ethical to engage in cyber attacks, even if they are done in pursuit of justice? Groups like Anonymous and WikiLeaks have used hacking as a tool for social and political change, but these actions also carry ethical concerns. While they aim to expose wrongdoing and hold powerful institutions accountable, the methods they use often break the law and can have unintended consequences. For example, releasing classified information can harm innocent people or compromise national security. The moral justification for these acts, like medieval rebellions, relies heavily on the idea that the ends justify the means. But where do we draw the line? When does resistance risk crossing the boundary between righteous rebellion and reckless harm? Moreover, the use of violence in resistance movements adds another layer of complexity. Throughout history, resistance groups have occasionally resorted to violent means to achieve their goals, whether it be sabotage, assassinations, or full-scale uprisings. In medieval times, these actions were often seen as necessary to fight against invaders or oppressive rulers. Today, the question remains, can violence ever be morally justified in resistance movements? Revolutionary thinkers like Frantz Fanon and Che Guevara have argued that violence is sometimes necessary in the face of systemic oppression, especially when non-violent resistance has failed to bring about change. However, others argue that violence undermines the ethical legitimacy of a movement, perpetuating cycles of harm and retaliation. The moral cost of violence is high, and it often leaves communities divided, as it does not just harm the oppressors, but can also harm innocent bystanders and diminish the moral authority of the resistance. The role of secrecy in resistance movements also presents an ethical dilemma. Just as medieval resistance networks operated in secret to evade detection and preserve their survival, modern activists often rely on anonymity and encrypted communication to protect themselves from surveillance and repression. While secrecy can be a vital tool for resistance, it also raises questions about accountability. When movements operate in secrecy, there can be a lack of transparency, leading to concerns about the ethics of their methods, leadership, and objectives. How can resistance movements maintain their moral integrity while operating in the shadows? In the digital age, this issue becomes even more pressing as hackers, whistleblowers, and activists work under pseudonyms or anonymously online. The question becomes not just whether the ends justify the means, but whether the secrecy itself risks undermining the legitimacy and ethical foundation of the movement. These ethical questions are further complicated by the personal sacrifices made by those who engage in resistance. The individuals who join survival networks and resistance movements often face immense risks, including imprisonment, torture, or death. In many cases, they are forced to make moral decisions about how much they are willing to sacrifice for their cause. This moral calculus, balancing the pursuit of justice with the price of personal safety and freedom, is something that has been central to resistance movements throughout history. Whether it is the medieval martyr or the modern dissident, the willingness to risk everything for a cause speaks to the moral depth of these movements. But it also raises the question, how much is too much to sacrifice, and when does resistance cross the line into self-destruction? The philosophical questions surrounding resistance and survival are as relevant today as they have ever been. The ideas of just war theory, when war or violence is justified, have long been a point of debate in both political and moral philosophy. The theory suggests that violence can be justified if it is aimed at correcting a greater evil, such as tyranny or oppression. But the practical application of these ideas in modern resistance movements is fraught with moral complexity. While survival networks are vital for resisting oppressive regimes, the moral cost of their actions is significant, and the lines between right and wrong are often blurred. As we conclude this section, it is clear that the moral questions faced by modern resistance movements are rooted in a long history of survival and rebellion. The ethical reflections on the use of secrecy, violence, and law-breaking in resistance highlight the complexity of the struggle for justice. These movements, whether medieval or modern, force us to ask uncomfortable questions about the price of freedom, the morality of rebellion, and the ethical boundaries of resistance. In the next section, we will reflect on the legacy of these survival networks and their lasting impact on the future of resistance movements, exploring how the struggles of the past continue to shape the ethical landscape of modern social and political change.